Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is second bite at the cherry in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 56. Root had, since its founding, maintained comprehensive notes on each of the Konoha clans. This was one of its more well-kept secrets. Clans didn't particularly like others knowing their secrets, and if such information were to get into the hands of an enemy, it could spell doom for every individual in a clan. Root naturally kept these notes under the highest security it could manage. Sai had gotten to look at these notes once, upon his graduation from Root's training program. Root shinobi were the ones called to manage most defections from the village, after all, and Danzo had justified maintaining such accurate clan notes as a safety precaution. If a Nara decided to defect and needed disposing of, for example, Root agents would need to know the limitations of their shadow jutsu and how best to counter. Sai had been given 6 hours to memorize the notes. A part of him wished his younger self had been rebellious enough to try and copy the notes in secret. Maybe if he'd had the full set, he would have been able to come up with a quicker strategy for facing Niji Hyuga. Instead, all Sai had were what he had chosen to memorize at the time. There were several hard and fast rules for approaching a Hyuga, and he focused on those to begin with. The first rule was to never fight a Hyuga alone. As Sai made his way down to the arena, coming to a stop face to face with Niji, he allowed himself to inwardly laugh. Already failed step 1. The second rule was to never engage a Hyuga in close combat. Their Jyuken was a superior taijutsu style on its own, but combined with closing off chakra nodes, a guaranteed loss. Sai vaguely remembered hearing that Naruto had defeated Niji the year before, despite being on the receiving end of the 64 palms technique, but Sai was no Jinhuriki. Thankfully, Sai considered himself a long-range specialist anyway. In any other scenario, long-range fighter versus close-range fighter would have put things solely in his favor. The Hyuga, however, had a unique rotating technique that was perfect for shielding them from, well, pretty much anything, close and long range alike. But unlike most people, Sai knew the third rule about the Hyuga, and perhaps the most important. The Hyuga had a blind spot. He'd never been sure exactly how Danzo had procured such incredibly important information, and now that he thought about it, if the Hyuga ever found out that there was a sect in Konoha that knew this secret, there likely would be. Sai smiled. Admittedly, the thought simply hadn't occurred to him before now. The existence of these clan dossiers, detailing their secrets, weaknesses, strengths, it wasn't necessarily illegal to know those secrets, but the clans would certainly riot over not having been told about this knowledge breach. He'd discussed with Sakura's old friends the implications of Root having stolen children for their ranks, particularly children from clans such as the Aburame, which they already had a small amount of evidence to prove. They'd never, however, discussed what Root might have learned from stealing clan children. An Uchiha might have been lost to war, raised in their ranks so that Danzo could study the Sharingan. A Yamanaka child might have perished in childbirth, and instead grew up in Root, taking the natural talent for their possession jutsu with them. Maybe the odds of him succeeding in battle against the Hyuga prodigy were lower than if he'd been sent against a clanless genin. But that didn't mean he still couldn't turn this situation to his advantage in a completely different way. He'd survived Danzo's attack. Something he'd never thought possible. Danzo had thrown some of his best towards trying to take them down and they'd survived. And now that his mind wasn't being bogged down by the immediate threat of death, he could afford to plan. He could afford to attack back. Root operated in the shadows. What was the best way to take on a group that had spent decades covering their tracks? The best first step, of course, was to start shining a light into the darkness. He pulled forth one of his blank scrolls and readied his brush. In front of him, Niji settled into the traditional Hyuga fighting stance. He'd have to move quickly. He wasn't sure how much Niji knew of his own style, but the instant he realized Sai was a long-range fighter, he'd be doing everything necessary to keep Sai on the ground. That meant Sai's first step was to get into the air as quickly as possible. 2 of my team have already fallen. Niji spoke, which caught Sai somewhat off guard. He hadn't been expecting a pre-fight conversation. They fought well. Niji continued. But if I am to bring honor to my team, and to myself, I must fight better than either of them. And if you think your fight will be as easy as it was for your teammates, you are sorely mistaken. Chakra flowed towards his eyes, and Sai saw his veins bulge with the influence of the Byakugan. Niji's message rang loud and clear. He understood that Lee had thrown his match for Sakura's success. And Gaara had already passed by his opponent's forfeit. There was no reason that all three of his team needed to pass. The cage would have expected a Jinhiriki to succeed, and they were more focused on the success of Sakura, the leader of the group. Whether Sai won or lost here likely wouldn't affect the success of the neutrality project. Thus, Niji had no reason to hold back. A strange feeling passed through Sai. Some of it might have resembled fear, but it took a moment for him to realize that the feeling might actually be anticipation. I took on Danzo's team. I wrestled a Jinhiriki. I'm about to face someone strong. Under Sakura's influence, how far have I really come? He put on his best smile. I wouldn't expect any less from the Hyuga prodigy. He could have sworn he saw a smile pass over Niji's face, however briefly. The proctor lowered his hand, and with that the fight began. What Sai would never admit was that he pulled part of his strategy from watching Naruto's performance. He needed a way to distract Niji long enough to sketch one of his larger birds, and this method had to leave his hands free. While he certainly didn't have the chakra required to pull out 100 shadow clones like Brainless did, he could definitely spare enough chakra to make, well, technically 4, but watching his reserves for this fight could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Sai settled for 2 instead, throwing his hands together to bring the clones to life. They leapt forward, drawing their blades to attack. Sai, however, did not focus on the end result. Instead he put his brush to paper, drawing the form of a bird as fast as his wrist could allow. The bird sprang to life just as Niji finished dealing with the second shadow clone, and though he was quick to try and lunge Sai's way, he wasn't quick enough. With a push of its wings, the inked bird took flight, Sai resting upon its back. The ceiling was high enough that Sai could float at least 10 feet above Niji's head at a leisurely pace. Smart. He heard Niji say. The boy had not even turned to watch Sai's circuit. Granted, he didn't need to move his head to see with the Byakugan. So you're a long-distance fighter. If you stay out of the range of the gentle fist, you won't have to worry about your chakra being sealed off. Of course. Sai replied. I'd be foolish to fight a Hyuga so close. Foolish indeed, though not impossible. Niji's head actually did turn with that statement, purposely looking towards Naruto up in the balcony. Naruto in turn gave Niji a grin that Sakura might have described as shit-eating. I can only do it because I'm the best shinobi around, you'd better believe it. Naruto answered. Sai wishes he was as cool as me. Oh? I wasn't aware you had been cool to begin with. Shut it, asshole. Sai let himself laugh as he began to sketch some smaller birds. It was time to see just how good the Hyuga defense was. The birds took flight from the page and shot towards Niji at high speed. At first, Niji blocked the birds with his hands, hitting them one after the other with pinpoint precision and causing them to burst into small puddles of ink. Sai brought more birds to life at a time after that, attempting to overwhelm him. When there were too many birds to hit, Niji simply spun, expelling chakra around him to create a protective dome that hit all the birds at once. I've fought someone like you before. Niji spoke, continuing to block Sai's assault expertly even as he did so. They were also a long-range fighter, using arrows to try and penetrate my defense. If not for a desperate move, I would have lost the fight. Even so, I nearly lost my life. When I recovered, I decided that I would never again be caught so off guard by someone who preferred that style of fighting. Thankfully, Lord Hayashi was willing to begin teaching me personally, and was happy to teach me a technique for just such an occasion. With that, Niji came to a halt to face Sai. He thrust both of his hands forward, and Sai only just barely saw the air around the boy's hands begin to distort and push outwards towards him. He ducked downwards, narrowly avoiding the strong gust of air that had threatened to knock him off his bird. He didn't remember anything about long-ranged Hyuga attacks. Either he'd forgotten, or it was something new. That is the vacuum palm. Niji explained. The force is strong enough to disrupt an opponent's vital organs. So long as I can see my opponent, it doesn't matter how far they are. I can hit them. The boy smirked. And I can always see my opponent. Cheeky. Sai wished he had a retort good enough for a comeback, but he was distracted from the thought by Niji aiming yet another of those devastating air strikes his way. The tables turned, and now Sai was desperately flying to escape Niji's attacks. More humorous was seeing the spectators ducking to avoid the strikes, especially those bratty Kage that had forced Sakura into this mess to begin with. Sai tried to linger on that side of the arena more often, if only so they couldn't get comfortable. There was a plus side to Niji's technique, though. If he was going for offensive, he couldn't do that protective rotation. That meant Sai had openings of his own, so long as he could accurately time the rhythm of Niji's strikes. A person could only move their arm so fast, and between attacks there was just enough of a break for Sai to sketch out one bird. He waited until he had a dozen ready to spring on the page, and from there began the first true part of his plan. All 12 birds sprang to life, and 11 of them shot towards Niji in a flash. Sai made sure they were spaced out. The last thing he wanted to do here was draw out the rotation again. He had the 12th bird circle around towards Niji's backside, waiting for the opportune moment before aiming towards what Sai remembered to be the Byakugan blind spot. The bird hit true, and for the first time Sai saw his ink impact against the Niji's upper back. Niji flinched, stumbling forward, but the attack wasn't severe enough to end the match. Sai would need to land a lot more for that to happen. He saw Niji hesitate, and Sai could almost see the thoughts going through his head. Had he found his blind spot? Was it luck? How had he found it so quickly? Keep thinking about it, Sai urged. This won't work unless you start questioning it. The dance continued, Sai ducking and weaving around Niji's attacks, and Niji knocking away Sai's birds, until an expertly timed bird hit the blind spot again, and again, and again. It couldn't be just Niji now, everyone who knew the Hyuga here had to be thinking about it. How was Sai hitting him? Didn't Niji see it coming? How? Niji finally demanded, panting heavily with the effort of the fight. He didn't elaborate further, but Sai knew exactly what he meant. How? That's a very good question, Sai answered. I would ask your superiors about what information is being passed around about the Hyuga. The answer might surprise you. And there it was. The bait was set. He saw Niji's head whip towards Tsunade, who of course probably had no idea about the extent of what Danzo and Root knew. But now the word was out. Not only Niji had heard this, but Hinata as well, and both of them would now have good cause to approach Tsunade about how Sai had learned of the Hyuga blind spot. He hoped Hinata would be able to put together the true plan. If Tsunade was forced to open an investigation into this, it would lead her directly to Root. From there, all the evidence they'd gathered could be used against Danzo in an official, Konoha-led inquiry. Shikamaru had told them before that his plan would be to wait until they had enough evidence. From there, he would wait for the opportune moment to bring Root's activities to light. But there was no reason Sai couldn't provide him with that opportune moment, right? They had evidence. They had due cause to investigate. And now all Sai had to do was survive a fight with what was looking to be a slightly pissed-off Hyuga. The vacuum palm assault began again, and this time Sai noticed that Niji's anger and confusion had somehow allowed him to attack faster. He couldn't help but marvel at this. Time and time again, Danzo had told him that emotions only weakened a shinobi, but here Niji had only seemed to get stronger. He only barely had enough time to sketch more birds, and even then it was becoming increasingly difficult to manipulate Niji into leaving his blind spot open. This was slowly becoming a battle of stamina. Would Sai run out of ink before Niji ran out of chakra? Using the shadow clones had more than taken its toll on his reserves, and he had already been recovering from the chakra exhaustion he'd taken on during the second exam. If he kept using ink birds, then the battle would last far too long, and it would essentially be chance who outlasted whom. He needed to change up his strategy. The ground was now covered in splotches of his ink. It was drained of chakra, of course, which meant that reusing it would require more of his own chakra, but if he planned this right, he'd only really need to use his chakra once, and the battle would be his. Sai continued to send the occasional bird Niji's way to distract him, but his true goal was now drawing long-inked snakes. The snakes began to plop to the ground, one by one, slithering across the ink blotches that remained from Sai's destroyed birds and smearing it in a very specific pattern. It didn't take long for Niji to catch on, and the Hyuga now dedicated time to stepping on snakes as they came near. This only served to aid Sai, however, as every crushed snake was more ink for him to use, and Niji couldn't attack all of the snakes and defend against the birds. Sai smiled, his plan starting to come together. One by one the snakes helped create brush strokes on the ground. The floor would be his canvas, and it was big enough for Sai to make whatever sort of seal his mind could think of. A chakra suppression seal would be good enough, if Niji couldn't disable his chakra points, that just left him with open-handed taijutsu. That alone wouldn't be nearly good enough to stop an onslaught of birds, or even some bigger inked animals if Sai was feeling like winning with style. All he needed was time and enough snakes to smear his design across the floor. He noticed, about midway into the creation of his giant seal, that Niji had stopped attacking the snakes at his feet. The Hyuga had instead decided to focus solely on the birds. Something about that triggered a warning within Sai, but he couldn't deduce in the heat of battle why Niji had decided to ignore Sai's plan. Was Niji throwing the match for him after all? Though there wouldn't be a real reason to complain if this was the case, Sai couldn't help being frustrated by the thought. He wanted to win, he realized, not just be given a win. He'd thought of a plan, he wanted to see if it would work. But pride wouldn't be a good enough reason to give up now. If Niji wanted to give up, then Sai would show him why that would be a very bad idea. The seal on the ground was nearly complete. All he had to do, risky as it was fall to the ground and push his chakra into the seal. With that, no more chakra for Niji. His bird swung low, and he leaped for the edge of the seal, hands outstretched. But before his feet hit solid ground, he saw Niji turn straight for him, and then Sai realized all too late why Niji had been ignoring his snakes. The Hyuga had been waiting for him to head for the ground. And while Sai wasn't close enough to be on the receiving end of the gentle fist, he was in range of the vacuum palm. And Sai wasn't capable of dodging in midair. Fuck. The pressured air slammed into him with full force, and Sai felt his entire body thrust backwards with the power of the blow. Eventually, he was stopped, but only because his body was slammed against the wall of the arena with enough force to push all the air out of his lungs. He felt a biting pain in his abdomen. Niji had claimed the vacuum palm could disrupt internal organs, and now being on the receiving end of it, Sai couldn't doubt the truth of the statement. The damage was only further confirmed as he was forced to cough and the color red came up on his hand. His back was sore, at least one of his organs had been damaged, and now his legs were so shaky that he wasn't even sure if he could stand. It was an interesting gamble. Niji spoke, and Sai realized that his ears were ringing from the blow. Using the ink on the ground to attempt to create a seal. But remember, I can always see my opponent. Your seal doesn't matter if you can't activate it, and for that you had to reach the ground. Niji leaned backwards into a stance, and Sai recognized the move that Niji was preparing. The 64 palms technique, which would seal a good majority of his tenketsu and make it near impossible to activate his seal. Sai tried to move, desperate to not be on the receiving end of such a technique. But Niji moved faster, and Sai's world became pain once again as he felt Niji's strikes land true. 2. 4. 8. 16. 32. 64. Sai fell to his knees after the final blows hit, gasping for air as he felt his chakra pull back. A normal shinobi might have passed out, and it was only the severity of his root training that kept him conscious. That was a devastating blow. The Hyuga had truly perfected the gentle fist arts to a terrifying degree. I won't say the match is over yet, he heard Niji announce. But you are no Naruto. I will give you a chance to forfeit now before I take this match further. Gracious of him, perhaps. There was a very strong part of Sai that wanted to quit. It would have been smart to quit. Is this the extent of my power? He thought of Sakura and Gaara, inwardly disappointed even if they were too kind to outwardly show it. It had been a rough fight, sure, but after everything that was where he'd chosen to give up. He thought of Danzo, reveling in the knowledge that his defected agent couldn't even find the strength to win one simple fight against an opponent whose weaknesses he knew. He thought of himself. Could he look himself in the mirror every day, knowing he'd given up here? As long as we move. As long as we draw breath. No. Not here. Not yet. He wasn't sure where it came from, but Sai found strength. He pushed himself to his feet, charging forward towards Niji, who clearly hadn't been expecting further assault. Coupled with the exhaustion of having to dodge Sai's attacks for so long, Niji couldn't move fast enough to avoid Sai's punch. It hit the boy square in the nose, and Sai was certain that he heard a crack as Niji was pushed back. "I don't need Chakra to win," Sai insisted. He saw blood dripping down Niji's face, broken nose for sure. It was almost a shame. Niji had a handsome face, and even with Tsunade's healing there was a possibility it wouldn't look quite the same after. But Niji hadn't held back, so neither would he. With that, Sai allowed himself to break rule number 2 of fighting a Hyuga, and he engaged in close combat. Niji recovered quickly enough to try to defend, but the gentle fist hadn't been cultivated to stand well against the chaotic combat style that was born from desperation. For every defensive strike Niji landed, Sai would get in an equally fierce punch or kick in turn. All Hyuga grace was lost as Niji was pushed backwards by the assault. With one ferocious stomach kick, Niji skidded back almost 10 feet, and with the new distance both fighters came to a halt. Their breath was ragged, and both were barely able to stand. Everything hurt. But in a strange way, Sai almost felt alive from the thrill of it. "You're a good opponent," he told Niji. "It's almost said that it's about to end." To his surprise, Niji smiled at him in return. "I agree. I think I see it now, why Lee was always so desperate to fight Sakura after all this time." Sai blinked in confusion as Niji forced himself into a fighting stance once more. He prepared himself in turn. He likely only had one more punch left in him, but he was going to make sure that punch had everything he had left to give. "Someone like you would make a fine rival." Sai could have sworn he felt something within him shift at such a declaration. Confusion almost stopped him from moving, but thankfully his instincts kicked in as Niji rushed forward, and he threw himself back into the fray, focusing all the energy he had left into one final blow. He saw Niji's palm, outstretched, and then there was blackness. Sai awoke in a bed, and he felt a familiar hand squeeze his own as he blinked and took in his surroundings. A hospital recovery room, by the look of things. He forced himself to sit up, despite Sakura's protests, and took in the damage he'd received. His abdomen didn't hurt as much as he remembered it, and though his hand was bandaged up, there wasn't much more that hurt other than the general exhaustion of the fight and his bruised tenketsu. "You're finally awake, you big idiot," Sakura said fondly. "Your fight is going to cause quite a stink, you know." "That was the intention," Sai replied. "I lost, I'm assuming." "Nope. It was a draw. You both knocked each other flat. It was technically better than a loss." Sai had faced down a Hyuga and brought the fight to a draw. They were of equal strength. The thought of that made him smile. "I see. However, Niji demanded that he speak with us the instant you woke up. Something about leaked Hyuga secrets." Sakura's tone changed to that of reprimanding, and she leaned forward to gently flick Sai on the forehead. "When were you going to tell us you knew top-secret clan information? I am going to get so much shit from Tsunade if this goes the wrong way." "You won't," Sai insisted. "You were ignorant. I learned clan secrets from Root, and I honorably kept those secrets from you upon my defection. Besides, it's not my fault that I was shown those secrets during my initial training." "Very true," Sakura admitted. "Shikamaru stopped by and called you troublesome, but I think he might actually be pleased with how things went. He told us we need to play our cards right. I actually think he's talking with Niji now, recruiting him to the cause. I think at this point we don't have a choice. Hinata knows what we're planning, but Niji doesn't, and if he pushes the wrong way that could jeopardize what we're working for. If Lee was smart enough to pick up on your political situation, Niji will be able to work it out with Pineapple." "I guess that's also true." Sakura smiled warmly. "That was one hell of a fight, though. I couldn't stop cheering when you stood up after Niji's 64 palms assault. You looked really cool." Sai felt a warmth spread through his cheeks, and he found he somehow couldn't bring himself to look Sakura in the eyes after that. He instead looked over to Gaara, who had a small smirk at the situation. "It was all right." "Cooler than your fight, Grumpy," Sai retorted. Oh, excuse me. You didn't have one. Sakura laughed, and even Gaara cracked a smile at the joke. They chatted for a while longer until a knock sounded at the door, and without waiting Niji walked in. His nose was heavily bandaged, but much like Sai didn't look as though he was suffering from much more than chakra exhaustion. I've spoken with Shikamaru, he announced, a slightly nasally tone to his voice. Coupled with some previous chats I've had with Hinata regarding her sudden and unusual desire to spend time at the Nara compound, I believe I've deduced the nature of your current situation. You are not just here for your neutrality pact, correct? Sakura nodded, but didn't say more. I will be speaking with Lord Hayashi about the information you revealed to me today, as will Hinata, but I can tell you now how the talk will go. Hayashi will go to Tsunade to demand answers, which she is no doubt expecting. However, given what I have just learned, I felt it wise to discuss with the three of you how best to proceed. In case we can help each other out. We have much to bring up with Tsunade ourselves. Sakura added. Shikamaru and I both. While I have no doubt Lord Hayashi would prefer to get answers himself, I think in the long run it would be better if we all went together. We have 1 month before the third exams are scheduled to take place, and we have to use that month wisely. I think if you are willing to work with us, we can get you the answers that you need and make things better for the village overall. I see. Niji replied. Then Hinata and I shall wait until you are ready, though I would not recommend waiting long. That will all depend on Sai. Sakura looked back towards him. When you can walk? I can probably walk now. The Konoha healers already did a good job on whatever Niji managed to hit. Just as long as you promise to take it easy. They found Shikamaru, and despite the protests of the nurses, they left the Konoha hospital and made their way to Tsunade's office. Tsunade didn't look surprised to see them, and actually shepherded them away from the office and into a room that was lined with so many protective seals that Sai was amazed anyone could enter the room at all. To Sai's surprise, Kakashi was waiting for them, along with a shinobi that Sai recognized as another former Root agent, Kino. The door closed behind them, and Tsunade sat down with a distressed groan. When Kakashi told me you were trouble, Sakura Harano, I didn't realize you were going to be this much trouble. Like teacher, like student. Ma, I suppose I was a worse influence than I thought. Kakashi added. I was the one who was supposed to be investigating Root, Sakura. Not you. Sakura flushed pink at this. How long have you known? Not long. Kakashi replied. Though now it makes sense why you were writing so many letters in your time abroad. Here I thought you were just my cute, popular student, but now I know you were plotting things behind our backs. Plotting good things. Sakura protested. If you knew about Root this whole time, then why have you allowed them to operate as they do? Do you even know half of what they get up to? No, Tsunade admitted. I don't. And that was the problem, of course. Root operated on its own, never needing to ask permission from the Hokage. That was how it had been since the time of the third. There was never supposed to be a need to question, as far as Danzo was concerned. I originally sent Kakashi out not just to retrieve you, Sakura, but to investigate the Root agent that had been sent to observe you. I don't think any of us could have predicted that you'd get this agent to defect. What we'd hoped for was Kakashi being able to get insight as to why Root was interested in you. We had thought it might really be Sasuke that they were after, but at the end of the day we just weren't sure. Danzo has always been secretive. Not even Hiruzen fully understood what went on behind his back. Danzo once ordered the third's execution. Kakashi added. But since the third pardoned the attempt, there was little that could be done about it. Root has legal permission to operate as they please, and there's never been enough evidence for Tsunade to move against them without risking Danzo leading some sort of uprising. The two are on thin ice with each other as it is. And then today happens. Tsunade looked towards Sai and Niji both, shaking her head. I get this announcement dropped on me in the middle of the exam preliminaries, and now I have several foreign kage who are looking to see how I'm going to be dealing with this outburst. You directly accused me of leaking clan secrets that I don't even know. Not you. Sai countered. Simply Niji's superiors. Danzo falls into that category. So your plan is to turn the Hyuga clan against Root, is that it? No, it was Shikamaru who stepped forward now. But it's going to be the start of a much bigger affair, and Lady Tsunade, your assistance in this is going to be paramount to our success. And just what is it you're trying to do? Eliminate Root entirely. There was a spell of silence, and Tsunade leaned forwards against the table, meeting Shikamaru's eyes directly. All right, brat. Tell me exactly what it is you're planning. Chapter 57, Sounding Thunder, Intermission Part 10. So that's your student, then, Kakashi-senpai. Yeah. My troublesome little student. Troublesome, of course, was the biggest understatement of Kakashi's life. It was hard to believe that a year ago, Sakura was the most well-behaved of his genin team. The Sakura of back then would never have dreamed of challenging Konoha's darkest system, right? But here she was, having dragged what seemed like every genin her age into this convoluted plot, a plot that he wasn't even fully allowed to know about according to the Nara boy, and even despite his lack of knowledge he couldn't help but think that somehow, someway, Sakura was going to make this work. But Kakashi wondered if he'd come to expect too much of her. She'd faced down Itake, yes, she'd succeeded in the Chunin exams, yes, but this was political warfare, not a fight. A different kind of animal entirely. He'd hoped the meeting with Tsunade would have convinced Sakura to have a bit of temperance, to leave dealing with Root to her elders. Instead, now Tsunade was on board with her scheme. Sakura and Shikamaru had managed to convince her this would work, had managed to give Kakashi a smattering of hope that this would work, and the strangest part, the part that really got to him, was the feeling that somehow the Nara had been planning for them to get on board with this scheme the entire time. He'd never admit it aloud, but sometimes Nara brains really scared him. And what are you going to do if this works? Tenzo was asking good questions. He usually did. If this worked, if Root was somehow peacefully disbanded, if the foreign cage were convinced to join Sakura's cause and sign into the pact, well, what else was there to do? He'd technically succeeded in his mission to bring Sakura home, but naturally she wouldn't stay. She wasn't a Konoha shinobi anymore. She wasn't his cute genin acting out, running away from home, she was now an ambassador, and he, well, he would always be a Konoha shinobi. His home was here. His precious people were here, most of them, anyway. Whatever Tsunade asks of me, Kakashi ended up answering. She might want me to help with reintegrating the Root agents to Konoha. She thinks I've done a good enough job with you. Many of them won't be as amicable to the idea as I was. Which is why I'm not fully convinced this is going to work. I don't think they are either. It's too hopeful to expect Danzo to step down without a fight. Tenzo was still watching Sakura and her companions as they made their way back to the civilian district. Tenzo had been watching Sakura quite closely since the meeting had started, now that Kakashi thought about it. He wondered what it was that was on the man's mind. Did he see something in Sakura that he was incapable of? We'll be prepared for a fight. Kakashi concluded. We have our orders. I'll make sure the Jounin are prepared for enemy forces. You'll be working on civilian evacuation. We fight a small-scale civil war. We win. Danzo is gone, Root disbanded. Everything works. Then what? You're so worried about the future, Tenzo. A war will weaken the forces of every village here. There are those that will want to take advantage. Akatsuki. Orochimaru. Even Kiri or Kumo might see their chance to take control of a slightly bigger border. Then we'd better hope Sakura can convince one or two of them that it's a bad idea. It was a hopeful thought. There wasn't a chance in hell that Sakura would be able to convince Orochimaru of all people to sign a peace treaty, and Kumo had been on shaky terms with Konoha after the Hyuga incident. Kiri? Who knew what the state of it was? All Kakashi had heard as of late were rumors of civil war and unrest. If we win, Kakashi-senpai, I'd like your help with something. Oh. Kakashi looked over, curious. Tenzo had never been the type to ask for help. Kakashi had aided him with breaking away from Root, sure, but it wasn't as though Tenzo had actively been begging for help at the time. But Tenzo shook his head instead of answering Kakashi right away. Maybe, we won't talk about it yet. There's too much at stake right now. But if we win, you'll help me. It wasn't a request that time so much as an affirmation of fact. Whatever it was, Kakashi was certain he'd be more than willing to help. When we win. He corrected Tenzo gently. We can't afford to believe that we won't. And if we don't, we won't be around to think of it anyway. When we win. Tenzo agreed. And then Tenzo smiled at him, that same trusting smile that Kakashi was used to seeing from the man, even in times where the situation seemed impossibly bleak. He wondered if Tenzo placed too much trust in him sometimes, but considering all they had been through, perhaps Tenzo had simply gotten used to Kakashi being able to save the day. He only hoped he could live up to his, no everyone's expectations. Everyone was loud, too damn loud. Shikamaru closed his eyes and let himself inwardly groan as his fellow rookies bickered around him, only this time with the added bonus of a grumpy Niji Hyuga thrown into the mix. Niji was naturally upset at how the meeting with the Hokage had gone. He was being asked to put faith into a plan he'd known nothing about, and he'd have to placate the Hyuga elders who were no doubt frothing at the mouth to get answers as to how Sai knew about the Hyuga's most carefully guarded secret. Shikamaru had to admit, Sai dropping that little tidbit about Root would have been much more useful several weeks ago, when he'd been trying to stitch the general plan together, but sometimes you just couldn't predict how the future unfolded, no matter how many paths you tried to account for. He just wished Niji didn't have to be so loud about his discontent. Think of it this way, Niji. Sakura spoke up, and Shikamaru just about wanted to kiss her for redirecting Niji's yelling away from him. If we fail to live up to your clan's expectations on the matter, you can deal with it yourself. Waiting one more day isn't going to change that Root knows about your clan secret, all it's doing is giving us a chance to deal with it in a way that the Hyuga might not be able to on their own without causing a potential civil war. From the sound of things, you're already expecting a civil war. Niji answered in turn. Besides, the clan will want to deal with Danzo personally for spreading clan secrets. What, and our clans won't? Ino butted in. It's not just bloody Hyuga Root's got intel on, as far as Sai can remember it's everyone. Unless we plan on giving knives to all the clan heads and having them all come and stab Danzo at the same time, it's unrealistic to expect any one clan to have some sort of priority on dealing with him. But it's not your clan that's just been called out on the matter. The Hyuga are expected to deal with this now. And we have been. Surprisingly, it was Hinata who spoke up this time, though she still fiddled with her hands and found it difficult to meet Niji's eyes. Shikamaru didn't blame her. Niji had nearly killed her the year before, and even if Niji had mellowed somewhat, he still struck an intimidating figure. I've been involved in this too, Niji, and I'm the clan heir. You can tell father that I have decided to deal with this problem myself, as is befitting action of the clan heir upon learning of this insult to our clan. I can talk with him tonight and help him understand. It was definitely unnaturally bold of Hinata to step up in such a way, and Shikamaru couldn't help but wonder if, somehow, this top-secret mission had been good for her self-esteem. Being a part of something outside her father's influence, being around those who saw value in her abilities and contributions to the cause, yes, it only made sense that Hinata would find confidence here. But the real question was whether or not she could keep that confidence when it came to facing her father. She'll do a better job of convincing the clan if you're in her court. Shikamaru finally spoke up. It's a lot to ride on, Niji, but if anyone can convince the Hyuga to play it our way, it's the two of you working together. Niji was quiet, contemplative, and though Hinata could not yet meet his eye, that did not stop him from trying to see through her. Whatever he saw, whatever Hinata had implied, it was thankfully enough. Niji nodded. We should go now, Lady Hinata. Better to calm your father's fire now than give it time to linger. With that, the Hyuga left, and after a time so did the rest of the rookies. Only Sakura took time to linger, and Shikamaru could tell that it was mostly nerves. Tomorrow they would be bringing their plan together. Tomorrow they would see if it would be enough. The problem was that Shikamaru wasn't sure that it would be. Not yet. He was still waiting for the final piece to make its way across the board, if it would make its way across the board, and that piece was running out of time. If that piece stayed where it was, their job was going to be a whole lot more difficult. Not necessarily impossible, but a lot more difficult. He eventually shooed Sakura on her way and made his way back to his bedroom. Inara knew the value of sleep, and if he went into this battle sleep-deprived, it would only be a detriment to everyone who counted on him. It was a strange feeling, being counted on. Troublesome. There was a part of Shikamaru that still wanted to throw in the towel and just sleep his way through the following day, not deal with this at all, but perhaps his mind had finally realized that sometimes, it was more troublesome to ignore a problem than to deal with it in the long run. He let his eyes close and tried to push his worries to the back of his mind. Sleep, he insisted to himself, it was time to sleep. Shikamaru had drifted off for all of 5 minutes when there was a knock at his door. He groaned, and in response he heard his mother's voice answer him. "Someone at the door for you, Shikamaru." "Someone important." "Important?" Shikamaru bolted upright. This was it, it had to be. The missing piece. The piece he'd been waiting for. He practically sprinted to the front door, startling his mother as he passed. He threw it open with uncharacteristic enthusiasm, and he couldn't help but grin as he saw who was waiting for him. "Just the person I was hoping to see. You are certain that this is everything that Sakura Harino has learned of our organization?" "Yes, Nagato." It was always odd, talking to one of Nagato's puppets instead of his true body. Nagato at least had remembered enough tact not to send her Yahiko's body, but rather another body that she had not been familiar with in its lifetime. It still didn't make it easy. None of what she did for Nagato was ever easy. "What do you think of her plans?" "Eliminating Danzo." Nagato answered, looking apathetic at the thought. "If she succeeds or fails, it does not matter. Once the Baijuyu are under our control, Danzo will not stand a chance against us regardless, and neither will she." "But Nagato, this might be our chance." Konan insisted. "We can get vengeance now, and we'll put ourselves in Sakura's good graces. She won't have any reason to suspect us if we help her, and that scum will be dash." "No, Konan. That is final." Konan had to bite her tongue to keep from lashing out immediately. She still trusted Nagato to some extent, but this? To let the one who'd led Yahiko to his death go unpunished when the means were right in front of them? She wasn't sure what Nagato was thinking. "We won't even be ready for the Baijuyu for at least another year. And I cannot afford to lose you to him too." That statement hit home. It was a small spark of humanity, proof that something was left in Nagato that cared for her still, but even then Konan was not sure it was enough. Nagato had grown so detached from the world in his plans for revenge that she was half convinced he actually thought himself a god. "You wouldn't," she protested. "I won't be alone." "No, Konan. Come home. That is an order." For a moment, she thought of defying him further. Nagato wouldn't kill her if she disobeyed, but he could disable her. Bring her home himself. Maybe he didn't approve of her actions, but if she continued to speak up now, there was no chance of convincing him otherwise. So she dropped it. "I hear your order," Konan replied, choosing her words carefully. Thankfully, Nagato did not press the issue further. His puppet leapt away into the night, no doubt slipping through Konoha's defenses with ease. She waited for a moment until she was certain that his presence had faded. It would take about a week to return to AIM from Konoha. That was a week she had before Nagato would grow suspicious. And if her understanding of the situation was correct, she likely only needed to delay her return by a day to do what was right. She left her room in a huff, heading straight for the next one where her genin were preparing to turn in for the night. "Prepare yourselves for battle," Konan told them. "Battle?" Yurin replied. "I had thought we had been disqualified from the Chiryunin exams. It is a different kind of battle that awaits us." "Be ready," Konan replied. She looked to her 3 students. Each were confused, but took to her orders quickly. The angel had willed this, after all, and they would never question her will. Tomorrow, Yahiko's spirit would finally be able to rest. Tomorrow, she had no doubt she would see Danzo dead. "You know, leader will be pretty cross if he finds you've detoured us all the way back to Konoha, Itake. What the leader does not know will not affect his demeanor towards us." Konoha had darkened as the sun set, and the low rumble of its citizens had quieted with the coming of the night. This quiet was one Itake was quite familiar with. In his time as Umbu, he had operated under cover of night almost exclusively. It was through this experience that he was able to pinpoint the areas where he and Kisame would not be disturbed. He had only intended to be here for a day, but what he had learned in his infiltration had intrigued him enough to make him wait. The Hyuga were up in arms. They had caught word that a part of Konoha had gotten access to certain clan secrets. It was Root, of course, it had to be. There was rumor about that the Hyuga would be bringing the city council to trial over this scandal, and if that was the case, how would Danzo be able to work his way out of that? And then there was the matter of Sakura Harino, the girl who had somehow broken through his Tsukuyomi. Which shouldn't have been possible, though perhaps his clan tablet held a clue that he had missed before. The one who had caused the Hyuga to make such an accusation against Konoha was one of Sakura's companions, and a former member of Root, as it turned out. He'd slipped, in his time with Sakura. Mention of Root had come to light. He'd been so caught off guard by the news of his brother that he hadn't thought. And now, it seemed as though Sakura might have taken that knowledge and ran with it. There was no point in confronting Danzo and potentially compromising his position if a girl was willing to do it for him. So Itaka would wait. He would see how the next events unfolded, and if it wasn't to his liking, he would speak with Danzo himself. Danzo and Hiruzen had promised, after all. They had promised to keep Sasuke safe within the village. And Itaka would see why that promise had not been kept. Chapter 58. Shikamaru had told her, at the beginning of their correspondence, that the key to success when it came to political warfare was misdirection. There were 3 ways of achieving this misdirection. The first way was to convince your opponent that you had different goals to achieve than what you were actually trying to accomplish. This misdirection was the easiest to achieve, but harder to keep up for long. A smart player would be able to piece together that certain actions you had taken did not align with the fake goals you had presented. Still, it was standard to begin with this type of misdirection, as the longer you could keep your opponent from understanding your true motives, the more time you had to set up for your real goal. The second way of achieving misdirection was to mislead your opponent about your own capabilities. If they knew your goal and believed that they knew how you intended to go about reaching it, that gave you room to manipulate your more secret pieces on the board. This misdirection could be accomplished in several ways, ranging from keeping your assets completely secretly to choosing which assets to allow your opponent to see, in order to make your opponent create assumptions about how you intended on using them. This was also fairly standard in political warfare. Nobody ever showed their whole hand until they believed it was time for the coup de grace, lest their hand be used against them. It was thus wise to understand that you would never be able to fully predict what your opponent would be capable of until the last, but at the same time one should never assume that the opponent did not know everything about you. Though assumptive thinking was necessary for political warfare, it was also detrimental to it. One had to find a balance between what they knew to be true and what they could assume to be true. The third form of misdirection was the most difficult to accomplish, but in the end the most rewarding, and that was to mislead your opponent about their own capabilities. A true master of the art would be aiming to achieve this third form at every opportunity. So what did it mean when 2 masters of strategy came head to head, each skilled in the 3 arts of misdirection? Shikamaru said that most masters of the art would say that the key to victory at that point was simply a matter of who had more time to prepare, if both opponents were of equal skill and intelligence. Time led to victory, and though they'd had weeks to prepare, Danzo had been fighting these sorts of wars for nearly a lifetime. By the standards of most tacticians, Shikamaru would be incapable of defeating Danzo without years of preparation. Shikamaru, however, told Sakura that most of these so-called masters were idiots. A true master of misdirection knew that there was a factor to strategy that was always overlooked. A fourth form of misdirection, though not one that could be controlled by either party. That factor was human nature. There was a reason, Shikamaru told her, why the Nara and Yamanaka clan had always worked well together. It was perhaps the only time Sakura had ever seen Shikamaru express pride in his clan. No 2 clans, Shikamaru insisted, understood human nature better. And that was where Danzo would fail. There were 8 Kage in the room where the final war was to be waged, 5 of whom Sakura could trust not to betray her. There were 3 Konoha council in the room, Danzo included, none of whom Sakura could trust not to betray her. There were also 4 Suna council and 2 Iwa council, the latter of which Sakura could trust and the former definitely not so. Each cage had 2 Jounin level guards accompanying them, and all the members of each council had a contingent of Umbu, all of whom Sakura could assume to be root shinobi. Tsunade had also had the wisdom to insist upon Naruto's presence in order to record formal affairs, and while Sakura knew Naruto's written skills were less than desirable, most of the foreigners did not tolerate his presence easily. There were very few people in the room who were aware of Naruto's status as a Jinchuriki, and that would work to their advantage if the worst happened. Still, when Sakura tallied up the numbers in her head, including herself and her 2 boys, the division between trust and not trust was scarily even. The only consolation that Sakura had was that she was counting on calling in witnesses who might help tip the scale in their favor, but even then, Danzo had come prepared. He had probably seen through the first of their misdirect ions, which was fine. This coming meeting was not meant to sway his heart one way or another. Sakura knew where the man stood. This meeting was essentially the last chance to sway 3 villages away from a potential war. If she failed here, things would remain hopelessly even. Thankfully, it would not be Sakura starting things off. Shikamaru had planned this well. Once everyone had settled into their seats, it was Tsunade who began the meeting. As I'm sure everyone here is aware, the Chunin exams have been enlightening for all of us. Tsunade started. Sakura was impressed to see that she was holding, well, not a poker face, but a very calculated expression that was somewhere in the scale between genuine concern and vicious anger. But what may not be aware to everyone here is the scale of the actions that have occurred around us. I have recently been given reason to believe that the village of Sunagakure has not only willfully endangered both the citizens of my village and the lives of the shinobi who are visiting here for the exams, but also attempted to shuffle blame onto my own village in an attempt to turn certain parties against us. This is why this meeting has been called. Seems like a matter to be settled between leaf and sand. Agano, the river cage, was naturally first to speak up. I don't see why you had to drag all of us here for this petty affair. It's not petty if the wrong assumptions could lead to a war, and a war could affect all of you whether you're in it or not. Tsunade retorted, already having shifted into her zone of taking no shit. I called all of you here today because I wanted neutral witnesses to the affair. Those who have signed the neutrality pact are here in case it does turn badly because, due to the pact they signed, they will be shouldering the battle alongside us. However, because of this, they are not neutral. I am looking to Aim, Kusa, and Tani today in the hopes that its cage will serve as impartial judges in this petty affair. I can judge it now. It's petty and not worth RTI-. Quiet. Sakura was surprised to see Konan speak up, and even more so to see Agano listen to her. Quiet now. Konan repeated. You want to hear about this as much as the rest of us do. If I have to hear more of your whining, I might just start a war myself. Sakura repressed a laugh. It was strange, almost like Konan had taken on a completely new persona. Where before she had been reserved, holding herself back, now she seemed actively invested. Perhaps she'd decided to be a more active participant in the affair after all, not that Sakura would complain. Agano kept quiet from then on, and Tsunade looked grateful for the opportunity to continue. Naturally I would not call such a meeting without adequate proof of my claims. I will turn things over to Sakura Harino, who will both present the evidence and act as witness to the events that occurred. Sakura nodded and forced herself to stand. She'd spent a good part of the night going over her various speeches in her head. She couldn't afford to stammer or slip up now. Her eyes glanced over to the Suna shinobi. Temari was strangely avoiding her gaze, but the Suna council seemed impassive, unreadable. They were older shinobi, likely well practiced playing this sort of game, and they would be her opponents for the moment. Esteemed Cage and honored council, it is no secret to the people here that Suna's relationship with my group is currently very tense. Sakura began. They had decided it was better to start off speaking frankly. Beating around the bush of the matter would only make it more difficult down the line. My companion, Gaara, was formerly of Suna, and not only that, holds the Baiju Yoshokaku, whom until Gaara's defection was considered a Suna asset. Suna has made it very clear that they desire their Jinchuriki back, and Gaara has made it clear in turn that he has no intention of returning to them. I believe it is due to this conflict that the events I am about to account occurred, or at least partly due to it. In that regard, Suna's actions were understandable, and within the parameters of the Cheryunin exams, technically legal. The crux of this matter does not lie with the events themselves being allowed in the exams, but rather the potential ramifications that these events could have incurred, as well as the implications of what these events mean for the relationship between Konoha and Suna. Sakura heard no objections yet, and she allowed herself to take a couple breaths. Her speech was a bit of a mouthful, she had to admit, but she could tell she had the rapt attention of everyone involved. She couldn't help but quickly glance towards Danzo, who was the most stone-faced of everyone in the room. He was piecing it together, she realized, or perhaps he had already pieced together where this conversation would go, but he absolutely could not afford to show it or take action yet. Right where we want him, Sakura reminded herself. Which is unfortunately closer than I'd like him to be. The events that occurred are as follows, and can be corroborated by both my companions and by the trio of genin that Lady Konan brought to participate in the Cheryunin exams. Sakura continued. Konan did not protest, which was a small relief to her. She hadn't known if the cage would be willing to allow her genin to testify if the need required it. On the first evening of the second phase of the exam, my team was attacked by a contingent of 4 teams of shinobi, all of whom were wearing Konoha headbands. This fact is the first, and perhaps most important, but I will return to it later. While one of these teams was taken out by our preparatory trap work, 9 still made their way to us and engaged us in direct combat. 6 of those 9 focused on keeping Sai and myself occupied. 3 of them went to Gaara, and they did so with a mission. With that, Sai stepped forward, presenting 3 large scrolls to Sakura. She placed the 3 scrolls onto the middle table that stretched across the room, unfolding each of them for the group to see. These are scrolls that were recovered from the 3 shinobi that attacked Gaara. As you can see by the detailed seal work on their pages, these scrolls are mediums for very powerful sealing jutsu. Jutsu that Gaara has testified are Suna made, and intended to remove Shukaku from his host and place it into another vessel. The 3 shinobi that focused on Gaara activated these seals and attempted to pull Shukaku from Gaara and seal him within this tea kettle here. Sakura waited for Sai to present the kettle as well, somewhat roughed up from its time in the woods, but undeniably a kettle of Suna origin. This action was desperate and dangerous. Sakura concluded. Once the unsealing began, there was no contingency plan in place for what to do if one of the 3 sealers was taken out, or one of the scrolls was removed from the equation. If the trio had failed to seal Shukaku within the kettle, Shukaku instead would have escaped his host and been allowed to rampage freely within the Konoha forests, endangering the lives of the exam participants and possibly even those residing within Konoha itself. To be blunt, if not for the actions of Sai, that would have been what happened. Thankfully, Sai was able to construct a new seal over the broken old one, and Shukaku is still safely contained. However, it cannot be stressed enough the danger these actions threatened to cause. If Sai hadn't been able to reseal Shukaku, who knows what would have happened to all of your shinobi, and yourselves included. This was, of course, something that Danzo had likely accounted for. Shukaku breaking free would have been the perfect cover for his little civil war to begin. Sakura glanced his way again, still stone-faced, of course. Finally, I will return to the matter of the Konoha headbands. The sealing of Shukaku and the mechanisms behind it have been a Suna secret for generations. How was it that Konoha shinobi came to have access to Suna seal work? At first I wondered if Konoha was secretly moving against me. However, I came to realize that there was a second option. In the event of the survival of my team, Suna sending shinobi wearing falsified Konoha headbands would have been an excellent way to turn my group against Konoha, which in turn might have begun the process of tearing my peace pact apart. If I was forced into an altercation with Konoha, I could lose their support, and in turn lose the support of others. So, here we have 2 options. Either Konoha has somehow stolen Suna seal work to use against me, or Suna used their own seal work in an attempt to reclaim their lost Baijuyu and used Konoha headbands as a contingency plan in case of my own survival. It was not the only option, of course, and Sakura knew it. The truth was slightly more complicated than either of those. But they had a game to play, and the game had to start right. Sakura turned to face Temari and the Suna Council, doing her best to calm her nerves and appear collected. I ask the representatives of Sunagakure now, how do you plead to my accusations? There was a heavy silence over the group as all eyes turned towards Temari. Temari stood, facing Sakura and finally looking her straight in the eyes. When she spoke, it caused everyone in the room to stammer in shock. We plead guilty to these accusations. It was clear that Temari's response was not what the Suna Council had expected. One of them stood up, an older woman who took Temari by the arm and hissed something into her ear. Temari stood firm, however, and continued to speak despite the chaos around her. We plead guilty. Temari continued. The Suna Council will not agree with my decision to speak up, but I am the Kazekage and I will not be silenced. She looked back towards the woman, who in turn glared at her in a manner that exuded death and poison. I have stayed silent until now because I thought I was doing what was right for my village. But, I have realized now that what my council believes is right for my village may not truly be what is right. If Suna has to rely on the strength of a Jinhiriki to be strong, then we are not truly strong. Are we not currently surrounded by several villages who have come into their own strength without a Baijuyo to their name? Temari took the moment to gesture to several of the cage around her, and Sakura noted a small look of approval pass over the grass cage's face as she did so. Suna believed itself to be weakened without Gaara's presence, and for a time I, too, was convinced of this. I was bitter at Gaara's leaving. I was angry towards Sakura for luring a village asset away. But, Sakura said it herself. Gaara left of his own accord. If Sakura had never arrived at our village, Gaara might have simply found another avenue to leave the village behind. We have mistreated him. We have neglected to view him as a human being, instead of a weapon. It was not Sakura who pulled our Jinhiriki away, it was us that pushed him. I may have failed him before as a sister, but I will not fail him now as Kazekage. She turned to look at Gaara then, as determined as she had ever been. Suna pleads guilty to Sakura's accusations. My council here provided Konoha Shinobi with the scrolls needed to reseal Shikaka within his tea kettle, in the hopes that we might be able to forge a new Jinhiriki. In doing so, we endangered Konoha and its people, as well as threatened Gaara's life. Sakura was bewildered. What had changed from the last time they had gathered here? Shikamaru had mentioned something about a final piece needed to pull their plan together. Had it been Temari the whole time? He had been guarding her during the exams, likely speaking with her, maybe dropping subtle hints to sway her towards seeing things differently. Shikamaru was a clever bastard. Scary, but clever. We appreciate your honesty, Lady Temari. Sakura answered, giving Temari a short bow. But your testimony here brings up a rather interesting question. You said that you gave the scroll to Konoha Shinobi to use, and yet Lady Tsunade here claims that she did not authorize her shinobi to attack Gaara in such a manner. We have a contradiction here. There is no contradiction. Merely a false assumption. Temari continued. Yes, this was perfect. Sakura could see exactly where she was going with this now. In fact, it couldn't go better. If Temari was speaking against Root, did that mean Suna was on their side? Though looking at the reactions of the council, Sakura wasn't quite sure yet. Temari was young, a new cage. Suna's soldiers would likely defer to the council in matters of war. Still, Temari was proving a valuable piece indeed. And what is this false assumption, Lady Temari? Tsunade was not in charge of the Konoha shinobi that we worked with. Rather, these shinobi were working under the direction of a different Konoha leader. And who would this leader be? He is here in this chamber as we speak. The man is Danzo Shimura, one of Konoha's own council. The attention of the chamber turned to Danzo, who was still fairly calm despite the accusation. When he did not speak, Sakura took charge. Councilman Danzo, these are very interesting charges being brought against. If the Kazekage is correct, I am to believe that you, behind the back of the Hokage, worked to actively attack and undermine myself and my companions, in a manner that threatened the safety of the village that you claim to serve. How do you plead to these claims? Danzo gave a small sort of shrug with his good shoulder, smiling pleasantly as he answered. Naturally I plead not guilty. These charges are ridiculous. I would never act in such a way without the Hokage's authority. Suna is attempting to divert blame from itself in order to avoid retribution. Yeah, of course you'd say that, you bastard. Sakura thought to herself, clenching her fist briefly to redirect her anger. What she said next here would determine how this meeting would be focused. She had to choose her words very carefully. You claim these charges are unfounded, then. Sakura spoke aloud. That the Kazekage is either lying or has somehow mistaken the situation. That is correct. I find that interesting. Sakura continued. Especially considering recent information about the shinobi that attacked my team in the woods. Lady Tsunade, might you please enlighten Danzo as to what I am referring? Gladly. Tsunade answered. When Sakura brought these accusations to me, I investigated the claims myself. I first had a squad of Umbu go to the woods to try and retrieve the bodies of the shinobi that attacked Sakura's group. However, upon arriving at the destination, there were no bodies to be found. I found that particularly curious. There were bodies of other shinobi within the woods, yet to be retrieved, and even though nature had started to have its way with them, they still left traces of their presence. Tools, headbands, even bones. Yet, the area that Sakura was attacked in was somehow completely clean. I figured it could be a coincidence. Maybe a large predator had made off with them. So I instead made my way to the roster of those who had registered for the Chunin exams and used that to deduce which shinobi it could have been. I could cross off the surviving shinobi, of course, and a quick scan of the woods and the bodies that had been left behind helped me narrow the list down further. I eventually was able to find 12 Konoha shinobi that were unaccounted for, and funnily enough, the names of each of those shinobi didn't correspond to the names of any registered shinobi under Konoha. However, all of the participating shinobi were required to provide picture identification upon registration for the exams, and I was able to cross-reference those pictures to find out who these shinobi actually were. With that, Tsunade pulled forward a massive folder from under the table, opening it for all to see. There were pictures within, as well as detailed files. These shinobi are registered under your root division, Danzo. Tsunade concluded. They may not have names, but there's no mistaking those faces. The shinobi that attacked Sakura were from your group. Perhaps they were. Danzo agreed. But you have no proof they were acting on my orders. They could have gone rogue and acted of their own accord. I certainly had nothing to do with the attack. Don't you pride yourself on Root's obedience? Tsunade demanded. Or am I mistaken in your ability to handle your shinobi? I will admit that in this particular scenario, my faith in their obedience was misplaced. Then maybe we need to talk about your capability to lead dash. Lady Tsunade, Councilman, if you'd please. Sakura stepped forward, not wanting Tsunade to get too heated. This had only just begun, and she didn't need the Hokage's hot-headedness to get in the way of their plan. Councilman Danzo, your current plea is that you did not authorize the actions of the shinobi that attacked my group, is that correct? Yes, that is correct. I just wanted to confirm this, for everyone to hear. Sakura replied. As it stands right now, our current understanding of the situation is that a rogue group of Konoha operatives, previously under Danzo's command in the Root Division, collaborated with Suna in order to reseal Shukaku and kill Sai and myself. Councilman, can you give us any possible explanation as to why these shinobi would act in such a manner? As of right now, I cannot. Lady Tamari, do you have any input? She saw the Suna councilwoman hiss some sort of threat into Tamari's ear, but to her credit, Tamari stood firm. I do. As of right now Danzo claims he has nothing to do with the actions of these shinobi, and that claim is false. Danzo has been corresponding with my council and I regularly since before our arrival to the exams, and met with us in person to discuss Shukaku's resailing. Easily explained. Danzo spoke up. A henjutsu can be performed by even the most inadequate of shinobi, and written correspondences can be done by anyone. These rogue shinobi likely posed as myself in an attempt to create dissent exactly as has been done now, in the event of their failure. I see. As it stands, Lady Tamari, Danzo is correct. Sakura noted. As shinobi, it is easy enough to conceal ourselves as someone else. I am sure your people know firsthand how easy it is to impersonate even a Kage. Tamari wasn't pleased by the answer, of course, but Sakura noticed a palpable relief settle over the Suna council. This almost caused her to smirk. Oh, if they thought they were in the clear now, they had a real storm coming. Naturally, If this was a one-off incident of rebellious shinobi, I would insist that the matter be dropped here. Sakura continued. The offending shinobi have been dealt with, and perhaps Konoha would need to run an internal investigation, but that is a matter for Konoha alone. However, I cannot in good conscience claim that this was a one-off incident. Not when there is a plethora of evidence to the contrary. The room was quiet, and Sakura realized she was almost waiting for Danzo to make a retort. When he did not, she decided to take her chance. This was it, right here. This was how things would start to tie together. Lady Tsunade, before I continue, I must confirm a few things with you. As of a few months ago when this peace treaty was first drafted, can you confirm that, through Kakashi Hatake as your chosen proxy, you signed Konoha into the treaty? I can confirm this. Tsunade answered. Because of this, can you confirm that any harmful action taken against myself or any of my other fellow ambassadors by shinobi under Konoha jurisdiction falls under mine or my fellows' rights to investigate, as per the fifth tenet of the pact? Kid, you're going to have to remind us all what the fifth tenet is. Alright. Sakura chuckled, pulling out the pact and opening it to read it aloud. The general statement of the fifth tenet is this: it is prohibited to harm an ambassador of the pact in any way. Any person under the pact suspected guilty of this will be subject to a trial of both village peers and ambassadors. Would you agree that, from the moment of Kakashi's proxy signing up until this moment in time, any Konoha shinobi that has aimed to harm an ambassador falls under my jurisdiction to call investigation upon? I would agree, yes. It is a thick document, but if you recall, each tenet of the pact has addendums and expansions in subsequent sections, and for this particular tenet there is an expansion that addresses what I believe to be the situation at hand. While the general statement of the tenet is that it is prohibited to directly harm an ambassador, it is also prohibited to willfully and purposely direct others to harm an ambassador. This addendum to the tenet was necessary, otherwise anyone could simply hire an assassin to kill ambassadors they didn't like, and would be immune to the consequences. Following this line of thought, not only do I have the right to demand investigation of any Konoha shinobi that actively try to do me harm, but I also maintain the right to demand investigation of any Konoha shinobi that have directed others to do me harm. You're too damn wordy, girl, by the sage get to the point. Agano commented dryly. I think we all see where you're trying to weasel this. I certainly hope so. Sakura retorted. Though I am unable to call investigation towards any action taken towards me during the Chunin exams, I am able to call investigation upon 2 attacks that happened during our time in Waterfall Country. The first attack, prior to our meeting with the Taki shinobi, occurred against my companion Gaara, and was witnessed by our escort at the time, Kakashi Hatake. The second attack, after we had begun negotiations with Taki, occurred against Sai. Both times the attackers were shinobi of Konoha, specifically Root, confirmed by Sai and Kakashi, both of whom were once active members of Danzo's organization. This information, coupled with Konoha's signing of my contract, more than granted me the right to begin investigation into Root at the time, and the further attempt to work with Suna against us that we have just discussed merely confirms my actions. Sakura turned to face Danzo then, and this time her determination did not have to be faked. This was where it began. This was where she'd drag Root into the light, whether Danzo wanted it or not. Danzo Shimura, by the power given to me as an ambassador to the Neutrality Pact, of which your village is a part, I charge you with willfully directing harm towards 2 of my fellow ambassadors. In light of evidence that I shall shortly reveal, I also charge you with willingly attempting to undermine the authority of your Hokage and incite internal rebellion against the Hokage's authority. Furthermore, I charge you with foreign collaboration, working with foreign leaders in an attempt to take over Konoha leadership. Finally, there are further charges, but I will allow those charges to speak for themselves once sufficient evidence has been presented. Under the tenets of the pact, you have the right to a trial judged by both Konoha peers and ambassadors, all of which are conveniently in this room as we speak. As for the other cage that are currently present, I believe it would benefit all to see the mechanisms of the Neutrality Pact in action. It would also do you well to see the competence of my investigative skills in action. However, I will allow a minute of time for anyone who does not wish to be witness to this trial to leave now. Sakura could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Naturally, there had not been any outbursts from Danzo at the accusations. He couldn't afford to seem anything but calm in this kind of situation. Agano, however, suddenly laughed after the silence had settled. Those are some very serious accusations. Foreign collaboration? Internal rebellion? I take back what I said about you, girl. You might still be a pipsqueak, but you definitely have some guts. I think I'll watch your little trial. It'll be amusing at the very least. The other cage sounded off as well, each expressing a desire to see the trial to the end. This was good. Sakura knew Danzo's allies would no doubt want to stay to see if their alliance had been worthwhile, but she had been partially worried about scaring off her own allies. Nobody had left, however, which meant she could proceed. Sakura took another deep breath. Thankfully, now was the time that she could technically call for help. At the time I decided to start investigating Root's activities against my people, I knew I would need assistance from Konoha itself in order to shed light on the truth. I admittedly did not turn to the Hokage at the time, partly because I was not sure how far Root's influence extended. For all I knew, the investigation would include looking into the Hokage's motivations as well. I instead turned to a shinobi that I knew would be more than capable of helping me investigate fully. He is a trusted Konoha Chunin from a prestigious clan, and his intelligence has been proven to be in the highest percentile time and time again. He has plenty of connections within the village, and it was with his help that I was able to put together the evidence that will be presented to you today. Lady Tsunade, if you please, I would like to call forth Shikamaru Nara as both a witness and a presenter to my investigation. Granted. Tsunade answered. With a wave of her hand, she shooed away one of the Umbu guarding the door. For a tense 5 minutes, the room was silent. The uncertainty in the room was palpable, and Sakura could feel that all eyes in the room were on her. It was a substantial relief when Shikamaru was finally brought in. He came bearing a large sealing scroll, hopefully packed full of the evidence they'd worked so hard to gather. For the next stretch of time, the trial was going to be in Shikamaru's hands. Right. I'm Shikamaru Nara. Shikamaru addressed the room in his typically apathetic fashion, and Sakura had to resist the urge to tell him to put on a more professional face. I've been working with Sakura to investigate Root. I think things will be easier if I put together a timeline for all of you. Easier to start at the beginning. As he talked, he began to unroll his scroll, pulling out various documents as necessary. Root was founded by Danzo Shimura after the end of the First Shinobi World War. It is not in any official history books, so I'm taking my understanding of its history from what has been dictated to me by various former members. At first, it simply consisted of shinobi that Danzo deemed capable of serving Root's ends, and at that point in time, Root existed as a means to be the unseen support of Konoha. Root performed deeds considered unpalatable to most, though always for Konoha's benefit. I'm sure every village here has a similar group. Even the Umbu can fall along those lines. However, there are some points in history that produced some troublesome rumors. The first bit comes from the Second Shinobi War. It's a bit fuzzy to how the war started, a lot of pointing fingers, so I am not going to delve into the politics of that today. But what I will dive into is the effects of Root on two countries specifically. It is possible that Root acted elsewhere, but as I don't have testimony outside of those countries, I'll stick with what I have. The beginning of the troublesome rumors comes from IWA. Lord Tsuchikage, I believe it was you that first brought it to Sakura's attention that you believed Root had stolen shinobi from your village in the past. At the time, you also stated that Root had made various assassination attempts on your life. Is this statement correct? That is correct. Oniki replied solemnly. Though our theories into the abductions are guesswork at best, we have recovered the bodies of the assassins sent to kill me. Each of them have a very distinct seal on their tongue. A seal we have identified as one given to all Root members. Shikamaru finished, pulling out a sheet of paper that detailed the seal. Sai here can show off the seal to anyone who is curious. These assassination attempts are not strictly out of line. Our countries have been at war twice over, and Root could have reasonably been acting in the best interest of Konoha then. However, the abductions, that's another story. If Root has been abducting IWA children, that's admittedly a bit concerning. Unfortunately, the third Hokage is not here to shed light on this scenario, so we must turn to the accused. Danzo, Do you have an explanation for these rumors? Lord Tsuchikage said it himself. Guesswork at best. Rude has participated in no such abductions. So that puts us back to square one. I won't dismiss the rumors just yet, however, but for now we'll focus on a more interesting subplot to the Second War. For this, I'd actually like to have someone else here speak. Someone who was there to witness the events. Shikamaru gestured across the table. Lady Konan, would you care to describe occurred in aim yourself, or shall I? Konan stood, and finally Sakura saw a sliver of emotion make its way across Danzo's face. Surprise, the man had definitely been surprised by their bringing in Konan. This was perfect. If they'd caught him off guard with this, that meant they had a high chance of catching him off guard at other turns. It meant they'd found avenues he hadn't actively been trying to cover up. When I came here for the exams, it was not originally my intent to speak up. However, Sakura has done well to convince me. Konan began. I am a war orphan. I lost my family during the Second War, and it was only due to the intervention of a Konoha shinobi that me and my companions at the time were able to live and thrive despite the war raging around us. In that, please realize that I owe a small debt to Konoha. I do not speak up against Danzo merely due to my village's prejudice. I speak up because the truth deserves to be heard. My companions and I formed an organization near the close of the Second War. That organization's purpose was to attempt to broker peace between the warring nations and end the conflict that had torn our country apart. Our group grew in size and reputation until at last we were summoned by Hanzo himself, who claimed that he would be willing to work with us to broker that peace that we sought so desperately. Our meeting ended in despair. Hanzo turned upon us, slaughtering my people. Only myself and one other of my companions survived. We retreated, broken and defeated. But time passed, and we regained strength. It was over a year ago now that our rebellion grew large enough to take Hanzo on. We defeated his elite guard and cornered Hanzo, desperate for answers. We wanted to know why. We needed to know why. Thankfully, my companion is somewhat skilled in the art of interrogation, and we were able to get those answers quite easily. You see, originally, Hanzo had intended to meet with us to discuss peace. However, he was approached by another man. Danzo Shimura. Hanzo told us that Danzo presented him with the bodies of his slain clan members, claiming that our group was the one who had slaughtered him, and that, rather than peace, we sought to usurp his rule. Danzo then offered to aid Hanzo with taking our group down, in exchange for Hanzo's assistance in aiding him to becoming Hokage. Lies. Danzo spoke up, interrupting Konan. A very convenient story meant to slander me. And naturally, with Hanzo now dead, he cannot confirm your tale. Lies, perhaps. But we can confirm one thing about Konan's story. Shikamaru spoke up again. In fact, we have witnesses to another point in history that can confirm that you, Danzo, were actively trying to take up the mantle of Hokage yourself. If those present consent, I would like to bring in Kakashi Hatake to testify. There were no objections, though Sakura noticed that one of the women of the Suna Council took on an agitated look at the mention of Kakashi's name, and appeared even more so once Kakashi arrived. She knew her sensei had a bit of a history, having fought in the Third Shinobi War, but it was only now that she was seeing the negative side of Kakashi's reputation. Kakashi, you have told me before in testimony that you were once active in Root. Is that correct? That is correct. Kakashi answered. Danzo approached me after the Kyuubi's attack on the village over a decade ago. At the time I was grieving the loss of the fourth Hokage. He had been my sensei, and we had been very close. I had been preventing from assisting in battling the Kyuubi at the time due to my age, and Danzo informed me that it had been the third Hokage who had insisted on that restriction, which had prevented me from aiding my sensei in battle. I was angry, then, and became convinced that the third's leadership was ineffective at preventing death and tragedies. I agreed to work with Danzo to spy on the third, who had resumed leadership at that point, and even agreed to aid his root shinobi in assassinating the third, after which leadership would fall to Danzo. The plan was set to go into motion until Lord Sarutobi discovered me looking through his confidential files, and confided in me some other facts surrounding the Kyuubi attack, which I will keep confidential. Regardless, Lord Sarutobi convinced me that my anger towards him was unfounded, and rather that it was Danzo's manipulations that I should be investigating. I prevented the assassination attempt, and from then on did not associate with Root. Lord Sarutobi forgave the attempt on his life, and Root was allowed to continue with its operations, with a somewhat firm warning. Very interesting. Shikamaru commented. Now we have two separate incidents, two separate testimonies around events in which the witnesses claim Danzo was actively trying to take up the mantle of Hokage. In fact, I would even go so far as to guess that upon the third's death a year ago, Danzo likely offered himself as a candidate for the position. That's correct. One of the other Konoha councilmen added. Though at the time we agreed that we desired someone younger for the position, who would be able to lead for a longer period of time. Danzo did not put up much argument at the time. And with that, we have at least 3 incidents. One can be written off as lies or a coincidence. 3 times? I think we're starting to see a trend. Shikamaru concluded. Danzo has claimed to be working for the greater good of Konoha, but so far it seems he has been working for his own greater good. It is still only hearsay and rumor. Danzo insisted. You've provided witnesses, but that is not reliable proof. Any one of these shinobi could have been persuaded into speaking against me. Right. You want proof? All right. I think it's time we start digging into that proof, then. Shikamaru agreed. Let's go back to my first point. Child abduction. That's something that was relatively easy for me to prove, at least within the confines of the village. Sai was actually a fairly good help in narrowing down what to look for. You have been abducting children to groom for use in your Root division. Sai was one of those children. And while I cannot prove that any of your Root operatives are from IWA or other countries specifically, I can prove that you have been taking children from orphanages and clans. To start, with the help of a Yamanaka interrogator, I was able to get 3 orphanage matrons to confess to working with masked agents to provide chakra-capable children. The children are taken, and the matrons work to eliminate what little trace there was that the children existed. The children are taken young, usually at the age of 5 or 6. Now, there have been shinobi who have been promoted to genin at a young age, but usually such promotions must be approved by the Hokage. I cannot speak for what the third approved, but I believe Tsunade here can confirm that she has not approved for the use of child soldiers in Root. No, Tsunade answered, and Sakura saw her fist clench just a little bit tighter at the mention. Of course I have not. Furthermore, I have testimony from Shino of the Abarame clan regarding the recruitment of an Abarame member into the Root ranks. Shino claims that at the time he thought little of his cousin's recruitment. However, upon questioning his family recently, he learned that his family believed Torin Abarame to have died in combat. I would hazard a bet that if we looked through the picture files of the current Root operatives, we would find someone who looks suspiciously like Torin Abarame. I wonder, Danzo, did your organization get permission from the Abarame clan to recruit one of its own? How many other clan children have died in battle only to end up in your ranks? And I wouldn't recommend trying to tell me that I'm lying. After all, it's only just recently come up that Root has a whole dossier on every major Konoha clan and their abilities and weaknesses. Sakura saw Sai's lips twitch into a bit of a smile at the mention. The Hyuga clan has made it more than clear that they have not willingly shared such secrets with Root. I'm sure the other clans will agree. So how is it that Root has come to have access to those secrets? It would make sense if Root has been squirreling away clan children all this time. Who needs the clan's permission when you can learn their abilities with stolen kids? Attempted assassination of the third Hokage. Attempting to align with AIM to take control of Konoha. Stealing clan children to bolster Root, almost seems like you've been building an army behind all our backs. If we add that to the recent accusations of your people working with Suna to undermine the ambassadors here, as well as claims that you've been speaking with various Kage about potential alliances, one has to wonder how loyal to Konoha you really are. Sakura could hear the various Kage muttering amongst themselves, and she noted that the Kage of Kusa and Tani were looking unusually tense, glancing towards Danzo occasionally. This time she allowed herself a small smile. They had him. They hadn't even dropped their final trump cards and they had him. Danzo couldn't weasel his way around these accusations. Tsunade could see right through him, and so could every other cage here. That already sounds pretty bad as it is. However, Sakura stumped upon another rather interesting rumor that I couldn't help but investigate further, and it turns out that your influence goes even further than any of us had thought. Shikamaru was on a roll now. Sakura had never seen him so enthusiastic. It's become relatively well known that Sakura recently came into contact with Itachi Uchiha. It was during this contact that Itachi dropped a rather interesting tidbit of information. Apparently he first demanded to know why his brother had left Konoha. Then, he said something fascinating. To quote, Itachi claimed that he was supposed to stay with Konoha. They promised. The root of Konoha. Which now begs the question of what exactly he meant. As far as the world knows, Itachi met and killed his family before leaving Konoha, a missing nin. Why would Root have been involved with this at all? The answer took a bit of digging, and a bit of a jump in thought. But as it turns out, someone in the past was looking out for us, and they left behind crumbs to point us to the truth. With that, Shikamaru pulled a small stack of papers out of his sealing scroll. The documents they had recovered from the Uchiha compound. What I have in my possession here is proof that the Uchiha clan was planning on rebelling against Konoha and taking control by force. Even Tsunade was shocked by the revelation, and she immediately reached for the documents to scan them over. Danzo was now actively clenching at his seat. Sakura mentally cheered. Maybe they'd had to fight off a weird Uchiha ghost to get it, but this was truly the damning evidence that they'd needed to bring this all together. The Uchiha clan was under a lot of suspicion after the Kyuubi attack. Shikamaru began to explain. So much so that their clan was moved to the outskirts of the village after the attack. Funnily enough, it was Danzo that authorized that force movement, and it was he that was an active voice of suspicion against the clan. Danzo, you claimed at the time that it had to be an Uchiha that caused the Kyuubi to rampage, and you vilified the entire clan as a result. Konoha began to treat the Uchiha quite badly, and eventually the clan had enough. They plotted an uprising. An uprising that you and the third Hokage eventually learned about, and I am quite certain you learned about it through Itachi Uchiha. Itachi was Umbu at the time, and was known to have worked very closely with the third. And yet somehow, despite knowing about this uprising, instead of attempting to make peace with the Uchiha clan, Itachi goes crazy and murders the entire clan. I find this a bit suspicious. Itachi acts as though he was acting on orders, but why would the third have wanted the genocide of one of Konoha's founding clans? We were crippled by the loss. Perhaps if peace was truly impossible it could have been justified, but there's no record of any attempts ever being made. I was stuck on this line of thought for a while, until Naruto helped me find the answer. Naruto grinned automatically at this, and as he did Shikamaru produced a final piece of paper from his scroll. It took a bit of digging, but thankfully Naruto is pretty good at that, and as the Hokage's assistant he has gotten full access to all of the Hokage's records. So here's the really funny bit, Danzo. Shikamaru slid the paper towards Tsunade, who paled as she looked it over. Approximately a day after the genocide of the Uchiha clan, the third made an official decree. This decree disbanded Root. Root was not supposed to be in operation after this date. Son of a bitch, Danzo. Tsunade snarled. You knew I'd never think to look for this. Danzo had nothing to say, though Sakura could almost feel the anger radiating from the man. He'd underestimated them. He'd truly underestimated them. Victory was theirs, all Shikamaru had to do was deal the final blow. There's only one reason why the Hokage would have disbanded Root so immediately after the Uchiha massacre. You went behind his back and had Itachi murder the clan to prevent an uprising, and in return you promised to keep Itachi's little brother safe. You presented it as keeping Konoha from civil war, but a little more digging revealed the actual truth. I worked with Hinata Hyuga to do a little spying on the Uchiha graves. Tell me, Danzo, do you want to guess how many of active Uchiha shinobi who were slaughtered that day were buried without any eyes? In fact, I have to wonder. Shikamaru pointed towards Danzo, a bit dramatically if Sakura had to admit, but the effect was solid. If we unwrapped that bad eye of yours right now, would we find a transplanted Sharingan underneath? After all, it had recently been shown that Sharingan transfers were possible. You've seen it work through Kakashi Hatake. Imagine if you had an army of loyal Root operatives, all with Sharingan eyes. That'd be a pretty damn formidable army. Not only that, with Sakura spearheading a peace treaty, I'd imagine it was fairly easy to convince a few foreign leaders that she had ulterior motives. Provide a few future allies with a target, and suddenly you have several armies that can help you overturn Konoha's rule towards yourself. The only thing you had to do was make sure that Sakura and her group were out of the way. If the ambassadors are dead, it becomes harder to keep Plains and Stone and Waterfall in an alliance. They'd likely return to their home countries to consider the future, and then you swoop in with your alliance and take Konoha by force. There was just one little problem that you didn't consider. Shikamaru gestured back towards Sakura with a grin. This one's a lot harder to kill than you thought. And that one. Shikamaru turned his gesture towards Sai. Proved a bit too good at sealing to get Suna there by Juyo back. And finally, you failed to account for the most important thing. Something you've tried to stamp out in your root agents. Something you've always deemed a weakness. Human emotion. This would have been a whole lot harder to bring together if the Omekage hadn't wanted vengeance for her fallen comrades. And even more difficult if the Kazekage hadn't felt guilty about ordering a death sentence on her little brother. So Temari had been that final piece. Sakura made sure to shoot the girl a grateful look, though at this point Temari likely missed it. All eyes were on Danzo now, looking to see how he would respond. Well? Shikamaru asked. Do you have any objections to my statements, councilman? Only one. Danzo stood, and Sakura felt the entire room tense at the man's movements. However, Danzo simply kept where he was, somehow looking calmer than he had before. You've got a very good head on your shoulders, young Nara. It's a shame that Root couldn't have gotten a hold of you. I hate to see such a promising young mind go to waste. You'd have been far too troublesome for me. Shikamaru retorted. I don't really like working under selfish traitors. I suppose so. But there is one thing you've gotten wrong, unfortunately. Something you'll be said to have missed. I have not created a Sharinon army. That would be too risky, a potential waste of resources. I kept all of the Sharinon for myself. Sakura saw Danzo's hand move towards his bandaged arm. She felt herself instinctively reach for her own kunao, and saw several others do the same. You are correct in that my failure to eliminate Sakura Harino has put my plans in a bit of a setback. However, you have fortunately provided me with the means to rectify my failures, and perhaps in doing so surpass my original plans. You have led all of your Kage to me, and I am now blessed with an opportunity to try out a Sharinon technique that I have only had the pleasure of experimenting with once before. Danzo pulled away his bandages, and Sakura briefly saw golden braces over the arm, though with a quick motion of his hand the bracers fell away. As Danzo's arm was revealed, Sakura felt a sensation of nausea as she realized that the arm, which was a strange pale white that looked oddly familiar to her, was covered in eyes. Dozens of Sharinon eyes. Shall I introduce you all to Izanami? Chapter 59. Nothing happened. For all the build-up, Sakura had to keep herself from laughing. No red skies bleeding in over her vision, no painful genjutsu, nothing like what Itaki had sent her way. The most terrifying thing about the situation was more the realization that Danzo had just been collecting all those eyes in his arm. That's supposed to scare us. She heard Naruto yell out, posturing as the boy always had to. I've seen cats scarier than that, old man. Sakura outwardly frowned. Maybe nothing had happened yet, but underestimating Danzo was more than a bad move. Still, hearing Naruto taunt him like that was a bit humorous. She'd missed Naruto's relentless optimism in bad situations. But all optimism faded as she saw a smirk appear on Danzo's face. Something that could make that man smile was almost certainly not good. As he did so, the shinobi at his side suddenly leapt forward into an offensive position, stopped only by Kakashi and the Hokage guards rushing to meet them. Around her, Sakura saw everyone beginning to mobilize, weapons drawn, hands flying through signs. Even Danzo had begun to move his hands, but Sakura let herself react before he could finish whatever jutsu he was planning, launching herself forward with chakra-enhanced speed. Danzo was quick enough to grab her wrist before her kunao strike could land, and that strange white arm turned out to be surprisingly stronger than it looked. Sakura felt herself struggling just to pull away. 1. She heard Danzo say aloud, and for some reason, he let go. Just in time, and perhaps due to it, as Gaara's sand came flying towards him. This forced Danzo to back away, and that was fine with Sakura. If they were pursuing, he was more likely to screw up. She threw her kunai towards Danzo's leg, only barely missing, but with a few hand signs she quickly followed up with water bullets. Danzo dodged left, right, avoiding her bullets, Gaara's sand, even several of Sai's birds that had made their way into the fray. The man was quick on his feet, she'd give him that, but months of Lee's training regimen had made her faster. Danzo didn't even have time to get off another jutsu before Sakura was on him again with another kunai, and this time she'd know what was coming. He'd block with that arm, and then she'd grab on and hold him down until Gaara's sand could take hold. Sure enough, he reached out and took hold of her wrist once again, and as Sakura moved in for the grapple, she heard him say something once again. 2. The word confused her, but didn't stop her from grabbing on and holding tightly. Seconds later, Gaara's sand caught up, wrapping its way around Danzo until the man was completely covered. Sakura had seen Gaara use the technique before, and as she pushed herself away she couldn't help but wince as the sand suddenly crushed inwards with frightening pressure. Sakura saw blood seeping through the sand. Could it have really been that easy? She wasn't given much time to think. There was a battle raging around her, and several of Danzo's men began to come at her with swords drawn. Gaara's sand helped block some of the blows, but one shinobi pushed through, forcing Sakura to begin to block. She switched between blocking with her kunai and glancing away blows with her arm bracers, until a well-timed ink bird from Sai nailed her opponent in the face and gave her a minute to breathe. And then Sakura turned around to face the battlefield, and then suddenly Danzo was on the other side of the room again, surrounded by his men, and the cage around her had only just moved to their feet. What? Sakura's body moved for her, and she lunged for Danzo once more, confused and desperate to figure out how Danzo had managed to escape Gaara's sand, and exactly as before, Danzo caught her arm and held her at bay. Welcome to Izanami. Danzo told her. This is a jutsu that decides one's fate. He hadn't done anything yet, Sakura's mind insisted, but he'd somehow gotten free of Gaara's killing blow, somehow manifested on the other side of the room. And then, just like it had before, she felt Gaara's sand rising behind her, rushing to try and trap Danzo once more. Just like before, it missed, and her body was moving again, throwing her kunai, sending out water bullets, just like before. Danzo grabbed her arm again, and Sakura reached forward to grab him. Gaara's sand rushed around the man's body, and Sakura pulled away just in time to see the sand crush Danzo's body with a sickening crunch. Blood. An attack from behind. Blocking an enemy sword with kunai and bracers. Turning around and then. There was Danzo again, on the other side of the room, his shinobi standing around him. It clicked for Sakura then. It was literally the same sequence as before. Figured it out, have you? Danzo asked as the shinobi around him moved into the fray once again. Izanami traps its victims within a loop. All I need to do to activate it is ensure that the same event happens twice. Anchor points for the loop. Grabbing her arm, Sakura realized. He'd done it twice, both when she'd struck with a kunai, both blocking with that same arm. Well, didn't that just mean she could break the loop by not letting him grab her arm? She thrust her hands towards the ground, this time sending an earthen pillar through the floor beneath Danzo. He jumped, and this time Sakura pursued with more pillars, shooting them through the floor one after the other. The man was good at dodging, she had to admit, but it didn't seem like the loop was happening again. And then the Kusa cage was suddenly there, wielding 2 and slicing at her with fervor. It took all of Sakura's concentration just to block the blows, and even then she felt the sting of the Kama's blade occasionally nipping at her hands. The blades looked to be enhanced with wind chakra, increasing the range in a way similar to how she'd seen Asuma Sarutobi enhance his own weapons. Gaara's sand wasn't coming to her defense, which meant she was on her own for a bit against a cage, but the fight was too intense to let her dwell on the thought for long. She forced herself to lash out with a punch, trying to throw the man off his rhythm, but as she did so the man dropped his kunai and grabbed at her arm, much like fuck. Sakura twisted to free her arm, and as she did so she saw Danzo across the room from her again, surrounded by his men. Izanami is a technique meant to decide one's fate. Danzo repeated as the room erupted into battle once more. So long as you refuse to acknowledge the results of this battle, you will be forever trapped within Izanami's loop. A fitting punishment for one such as you that continues to defy me. Fuck you! Sakura cried out before launching forward once more. She pushed herself into the air, this time aiming a kick at Danzo's head. Maybe it was impossible, but if she had to go through this entire fight using nothing but her legs to break this loop, that was what she'd do. She pushed her chakra through her legs, summoning earthen pillars with a stomp and lashing out every time she got close enough to hit. She let herself spin, trying to nail Danzo with a rotating kick, but Danzo was suddenly gone, no, behind her. He grabbed at the arm she was using to balance herself, and she saw the man smirk once more before the world shifted and Danzo was across the room from her, surrounded by his men. You won't be able to change the outcome of this battle simply by acting differently. This is one of the Sharingan's ultimate genjutsu. None of this is real. The real you is comatose, unable to move or perceive the world around you until this jutsu runs its course. Or until one of my allies kills you. It wasn't real, of course it wasn't real. Sakura could have hit herself. She'd been so caught up in the battle, but if this was a Sharingan genjutsu, of course it had immobilized her. She wasn't really moving here, she wasn't really using jutsu. All part of the illusion. She clasped her hands around her necklace, concentrating, willing herself to push her chakra away from her head. She didn't know how to purge it like she had before, but she did know that her amulet had gotten hot, and then. But nothing happened, and her chakra didn't leave her. The fight raged on around her, and Danzo remained where he was, as calm and arrogant as ever. I was worried, I will admit. Danzo explained, suddenly rushing forward in an attempt to strike. Sakura dodged, and now she was on the run as Danzo pursued her. When I first heard that you'd escaped attack as Sharingan, I was skeptical. The Tsukuyomi isn't meant to be broken. I chalked it up to chance, or perhaps a skewed version of the truth. Sakura ducked as Danzo fired a wind jutsu towards her, but that only gave Danzo an opportunity to grab at her arm once more, and the room returned to the start of the loop. I decided to see for myself if it was true after you escaped my trap in the Chunin exams. Danzo continued to speak, once again coming for Sakura. His speech was not interrupted by the battle, and every time the loop restarted, Danzo continued as if nothing had changed. I decided that if you were strong enough to escape my trap and reseal a Jinhiriki, then perhaps you would be more valuable as an ally. I would use one of my most coveted techniques on you. Danzo paused just long enough to pull back the bandages around his eye, and Sakura saw a Sharingan there as well. This belonged to a very powerful Uchiha. He unlocked a technique called the Koda Amatsukami, perhaps the strongest genjutsu I have ever seen wielded in my lifetime. It is so powerful that it cannot be used very often, unless you enhance your body as I have. Using it on a person allows you to enter their mind and give them false experiences, making them seem as though actions you force them to take are being done of their own free will. It's proven a very helpful jutsu in the past. The Suna Council and the leaders of Grass and Valley fell under its influence quite easily. He'd manipulated them into following his plans, Sakura realized. Manipulated them with this strange Sharingan technique. No wonder Suna had gotten the balls to try invading again after the last failure, no wonder it had been so easy to convince them to give a Baijuya sealing scroll over to Danzo's men. I had thought to try it on you. Danzo admitted. So I came to you in your room, attempting to bring you under its sway. I had been hesitant before, with the rumors, but I had no choice then. If I did not bring you under my control, things would no doubt turn ugly. Imagine my surprise when I encountered resistance. As the loop started again, Sakura reached up to touch at her amulet. Whatever had saved her from Itaka's jutsu before, had it also saved her then? She hadn't even realized, hadn't felt a thing. Of course Danzo wouldn't have just come to talk. He'd come to try and fucking brainwash her, and it was sheer luck he hadn't managed it. Whatever power lies in you, Sakura Harano, is very strong against the Sharingan, it seems. However, it was not strong enough to save you from Izanami. Only your submission to fate will save you now. I will win this fight. I will win the battle for Konoha. You will either join me or die. How about neither? Sakura insisted, throwing herself into the fray once more. There had to be something she could do, some way to break the sequence and thus break the genjutsu. If she couldn't release her chakra, if her amulet wouldn't save her, she had to save herself, and if she had to face this sequence again and again until she figured out the trick, that was what she'd do. And Sakura faced it. Again and again and again. There was a strange sort of exhaustion threatening to come over her. While her body never tired, her mind was beginning to tire of the exchange. She'd tried every jutsu she knew, tried going for other opponents, the cage, the bodyguards, Danzo again, but every time someone grabbed her arm the sequence started over, and Danzo taunted her once more. "Accept your fate. You will not win this fight." He said that every time the sequence restarted, like a mantra, over and over again in her mind. Had Danzo only managed to trap herself within the jutsu, or was everyone else in the room also stuck in this loop? She stole a longer glance at Danzo's arm and realized that about 10 of the eyes on his arm had closed shut. Enough for herself, her companions, the cage that opposed him, maybe Naruto and Kakashi and Shikamaru as well, assuming that the illusion was correct. Konoha was screwed if its leader and one of its strongest shinobi had been disabled by Danzo's Sharingan. Not only that, her allied villages wouldn't have leaders to organize them and mobilize them against what would no doubt be a soon-to-come attack. How much time had passed in the real world since the illusion had begun? Was Konoha already doomed? She couldn't give up. She had to keep trying to find a way to break the jutsu. She couldn't accept this fate, couldn't just. Sakura froze. The answer that came to her was so simple, but maybe that was how it was supposed to be. Maybe it was really just as simple as that. Sakura smiled. "You want me to accept that I will lose this fight?" Sakura confirmed. "Okay. I accept it." She saw Danzo hesitate, and to her right she saw the Kusa cage lunging for her again, scythes outstretched. Sakura smiled. "Just because I lose this fight doesn't mean I lose against you. You can have this fight. And when I wake up from this stupid jutsu, then I'll get to win." She closed her eyes and let the scythes hit her. She would lose this fight. Sakura gasped, and suddenly the world rushed in around her. She heard the clashing of metal around her and felt rushes of air as jutsu hit nearby. Her vision was fuzzy at first, bleeding in from the center out. Eventually she processed that there was somehow sand around her, tons and tons of sand. Lying on the ground next to her, she saw a prone Kakashi, Tsunade, everyone she'd theorized to have been hit by Danzo's jutsu, and all of them looked as though they were in a deep slumber. And yet, Gaara was awake, standing above her and holding a sand barrier around them with fierce determination. Had Danzo somehow missed? Why would he have put everyone else under his Izanami and not him? Unless Gaara had put together the loophole of the jutsu first. "So, you're finally awake?" Wait, that wasn't Gaara's voice. There was something about it that just seemed wrong, like Gaara's voice had dropped a few octaves. For a moment, all Sakura could do was stare in confusion. Gaara looked back at her, and she realized there was a familiar glow of chakra around him, like she'd seen before in the Chunin exams. But Gaara's eyes looked different, like the pupils had somehow changed. "The phrase I'm looking for is, 'Thank you for saving my worthless, pathetic life, Shukaku.'" That snapped Sakura to attention. "Shukaku?" she said, bewildered. "Don't look so surprised. That idiot of a Sharingan wielder forgot the most important thing about facing my Jinchuriki. Don't fucking put him to sleep. Even with the new seal. The seal brat put our chakra in harmony. Doesn't prevent me from being able to slip in if the host takes a nap. Now that one, on the other hand." "Gaara, no," Shukaku gestured at Naruto, laying down nearby and just as comatose as the others. "Whomever did that seal really wanted to make sure that Fox never came out. It's kind of unfortunate. As much as I hate to admit it, having the Fox wreaking havoc out there could have been useful." As he spoke, a shinobi threw himself at the barrier, only to be swatted away by sand. "It's also too bad that bastard fled the moment he realized I was still awake." The other leaders tried to take out the sleeping ones before they could wake up again, but Shukaku grinned, looking equal parts cocky and maniacal. "There isn't a damn human alive that's going to get through my barrier." Even though seeing Shukaku puppet Gaara's body was a bit unnerving, Sakura couldn't help but grin back. As weird as this is, I'm glad you're with us. Don't get used to it, brat. I just refuse to let my host die to a goddamn genjutsu. It would be insulting. Sakura wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. Having any ally awake was something worthwhile. Beyond the barrier of sand, Sakura could see all of the cage's bodyguards brawling, some attempting to breach the sand barrier, some attempting to defend it. The enemy cages, however, were nowhere in sight, and neither was Danzo. Shit. Sakura let herself curse aloud. She could attempt to pursue Danzo, but that would mean leaving her entrapped companions behind. She needed to find a way to wake them, but how? There were two ways to break a Sharingan genjutsu, this much she knew from experience. One, and perhaps the better method if possible, would be somehow conveying to the person the loophole she used to break through as Izanami. The second method would be to try draining their chakra until the enemy chakra was cycled out. That was like what had happened facing Itachi, though Sakura had no idea how she'd done it, but there were ways for people to drain other people's chakra. But that method would likely mean that the awakened person would be unable to defend themselves well, being suddenly devoid of chakra. A double-edged sword. But Lee made it alright without jutsu. Any shinobi could wield a kunai or a blade. If the second method was what it took, Sakura would have to take it. However, there was another idea she could try first. Shukaku, can you continue to guard them? I'm going to see if I can get help. I might know a way to help wake them up. So long as you do it quick. I don't like moving around in this pathetic body. Well, if you can reach Gaara, tell him that he needs to accept that he'll lose the battle he's in. He needs to give up. Right. That sounds stupid, but I guess that's humanity in a nutshell. It was as good as Sakura was going to get. She prepared to make a run for it, looking about for an opponent before she suddenly saw movement next to her. Shikamaru was getting up. She smiled. Of course the neighborhood genius would be able to figure out the loophole too. Sakura instantly made her way to his side, helping him sit up as he came to. That's it, I quit being a shinobi. Forever. What? You can't quit now. Sakura insisted. We're literally in the middle of a civil war. Yeah, well, I'm out. Every time I put in an effort to fix something, it goes to the worst possible shit imaginable. This is such a damn drag. He was thinking of Sasuke, Sakura realized, the last major high-ranked mission he'd been on. Shikamaru had been leading that mission, and it had failed. Of course Shikamaru would be taking this hard. As of right now, things looked dire. Think of it this way. He wouldn't have sprung this on us if you hadn't driven him into the tightest corner he'd ever been in. Great. I'll be remembered as the shinobi that almost took Danzo down. We still have a chance, Shikamaru. We just need to wake everyone else up and rally everyone together. Danzo can't stand a chance against all of us and he knows it, that's why he risked trying to put us all in that freaky genjutsu. Right, and do you really think Naruto never fucking gives up? Uzumaki is going to be able to accept defeat anytime soon. Shikamaru frowned as he looked over to his sleeping teammate. Maybe some of the others will put it together after a while, but who knows how long that will be. So help me find someone who can help them figure it out. Sakura countered. All we need to do is send them a message, right? Right, oh. We need Yamanakas. But that requires going out there. Yes it does. Shikamaru groaned, but he didn't protest as Sakura hauled him to his feet. Two people attempting to find a Yamanaka in this chaos would be better than one, and if she was going to leave the safety of Shukaku's shield, she'd prefer someone at her back. They waited until there was an opening, and then the two of them ran. They were pursued, at first, but one of Onaki's bodyguards gave chase and distracted their pursuer long enough for them to get a lead. Unfortunately, the lead didn't help with the other problem, the village was in complete and utter chaos. Shinobi of all sorts were locked in various battles, and Sakura could tell just from a glance that nobody was really certain who was on what side. Sometimes Konoha shinobi assisted and sometimes they turned enemy, and because of that it looked as though nobody was really certain which village they should be fighting either. Kunai, shuriken, and jutsu were being thrown about like candy, and the only consolation Sakura had was that she couldn't see any civilians around in the crossfire. Kakashi had mentioned planning an emergency evacuation if things went south, and she was grateful that that plan, at least, seemed to have held together. It was Chuji, along with several other Akimichis, that they found first. The Akimichi expansion technique made them rather easy to find, and from there Chuji easily pointed in the direction of his Yamanaka teammate. Ino was fighting back-to-back with Tenten, applying poisons to the Kunoichi's weapons before they were thrown at the enemies around them. Sakura could also see Hinata's team in the distance, and nearby Lee and Niji were doing their best to keep the heat off of the more stationary fighters. Perfect. Not just that Ino was there, but Shino as well. If her first plan failed, Shino's Kikaicha could drain an opponent of chakra fairly quickly. If neither of those plans worked, then she was stuck anyway, but if she brought all of the Rookie 9 and Lee's team, she'd be able to at least have a relatively solid team to try and stop a war. She didn't let herself dwell. Her plan hadn't failed yet. A few shouts and directions later and Sakura was on her way back with 8 more shinobi in tow. It was much easier to navigate through a battlefield when you had 10 talented shinobi working together, especially with 2 Byakugan users able to call out when someone was headed their way. Lee had taken off his weights and sped around the group faster than Sakura could even keep track, kicking down enemies before they knew what hit them. Sakura missed it, she realized, having her old classmates working together, backing each other up, and she knew it wouldn't be the last time she'd wonder if leaving Konoha had really been the best idea. When they arrived back in the council room, Sakura was surprised to note that the fighting had stopped inside. The enemy had moved on, perhaps having given up with a dedicated Baijuya protecting the sleeping cage. She wouldn't complain about the break. Sakura dragged Ino to Naruto's side to begin with. You were experimenting with trying to communicate with the Kyuubi, right? Do you think you could try to connect with Naruto instead? Maybe. Ino replied, already looking nervous at the prospect. But what if I get stuck in that jutsu too? You already know how to break it. You just have to give up and let the jutsu win. You're really sure this will work? Sakura wasn't, but she certainly wasn't going to make this more difficult for Ino by admitting this. Ino, are you not the beautiful and talented Yamanaka heir? Are you not the master of minds? The strongest kunoichi of our year? It didn't completely encourage Ino, but it was enough to bring a smile to the girl's face. I'm not going to forget you said that, billboard brow. I do this, I'm the strongest kunoichi of our year, and you cannot take it back. Ino made a single hand sign, the sign for the mind transfer jutsu, and aimed it at the sleeping Naruto. Sakura caught her as she slumped over, and for an agonizing minute, all she could do was wait. Then, to Sakura's relief, both Ino and Naruto began to stir at once. It had worked. From there, they moved to each trapped shinobi, and Ino hit them with her jutsu one by one. Each awakened within minutes, and several of them looked sheepish at not having put together the loophole sooner. It was Oniki that seemed the most pleased with the situation. Though his joints cracked as he stood, he looked more than ready for battle. Sakura, my girl, you remember what I told you all those weeks ago? The Uchiha are as fallible as any shinobi, and that includes the power of the Sharingan. Leave it to my student to prove me right. Sakura felt a small flush of pride at Oniki's compliment. I didn't do anything special, sensei. Danzo just left one hell of a loophole. One we should have figured out sooner. Tsunade admitted with a growl. When I get my hands on that bastard, I'm going to squish him like a demmed grape. Get in line, Granny. Naruto was alive with chakra as he stood up, and Sakura recognized that he was channeling a similar aura from his Baijuya that Gaara was now channeling from Shukaku. The old man's mine. To be honest, I feel like there's going to be quite a big line if we all want our way. Shivuki added. Might I suggest first regaining control of the village? The enemy leaders are under a different genjutsu of Danzo's. If you can, maybe try not to kill them. Sakura suggested, wincing as she did so. If we take Danzo down, it might break his hold over them. Sakura makes a good point. That puts us at 2 priorities. Oniki agreed. My fellow Kage, we should focusing on rallying our shinobi and subduing our enemy. The rest of you, find Danzo. Tsunade ordered. If you feel like you can safely engage, take him down. Kakashi, I'm putting you in charge. Kakashi lifted his headband up, revealing his Sharingan. That jutsu won't work on us twice. It'll be a different fight this time. That was something Sakura could agree on. Danzo's trick had been just that, a trick. And now that she was about to have a dozen people on her side, all of whom knew the secret to breaking out of that particular genjutsu, Danzo didn't stand a chance. She cracked her knuckles as they prepared to move out. No more tricks. No more nonsense. Danzo was going down now. Chapter 60. Kakashi's demeanor shifted the minute they left the building, and Sakura realized she had seen this in him only once before, and that was when Suna and Oto had attacked their village the year prior. This was not just the demeanor of a man being presented with a difficult enemy to fight. This was not even necessarily just a worried demeanor. This was Kakashi's wartime mindset, and it manifested in curt command of the genin around him, as well as a methodical, perhaps brutal dispatch of any shinobi that stood in their way. She saw a similar shift in both Gaara and Sai, though Sakura wouldn't have necessarily accredited this to wartime experience so much as it was experience with the dirtier side of the shinobi world. They'd both likely been able to make this shift as a child, due to the circumstances under which they were raised. Sakura wondered, briefly, if she had made this shift herself. The year before, she'd always hesitated when striking blows against enemies. She didn't enjoy the concept of causing pain to others. Didn't enjoy seeing someone devastated at her hands, or even the hands of her comrades. She remembered back when the curse mark had first manifested on Sasuke. He'd fought to defend her and Naruto, fought for vengeance against the people who had brutalized her, and yet, when Sasuke had moved to disable his opponent, she'd stopped him. It had been vicious, sure, and she wouldn't have wished what Sasuke had done to the boy on anyone. But in the shinobi world, that sort of treatment was commonplace. If you couldn't kill your enemy, disable them permanently so they can never come at you again. Even now, Sakura found herself somewhat nauseous at the concept. And yet, here she was, rock morphed around her fists with chakra, and every time she landed a blow on an enemy she could feel the crunch of bone beneath, could hear her foe cry out in pain. This was war, this was necessary for her survival, for her friend's survival, and in the heat of combat she couldn't even bring herself to feel sympathy for her enemies. They were people too, people who had been misled by Danzo, by others. People with families and lives of their own, people who were simply following orders, doing what they thought was best for the betterment of their country. And she and hers were doing the same. In this particular scenario, Sakura didn't feel as bad as she likely could have. These people had chosen to attack first, had chosen to agree to fight in a war that could have potentially involved civilians, innocents, unnecessary death, had chosen a war itself knowing the consequences. They thought they were right. Danzo thought he was right. Danzo had started a civil war because he thought Konoha was weak and that he could lead it better. Danzo had ordered the death of the Uchiha because he'd both wanted to obtain the power to protect his village and because he'd believed that an Uchiha uprising would have destroyed Konoha. Everything Danzo had done, he'd done because he'd believed himself righteous. He was wrong, Sakura insisted to herself. He was wrong. But in a world where Danzo had succeeded, he'd be right, and that was the thought that scared her. What in her world was considered right that another would consider abhorrent? If her ambassador group grew in power, they would help build the laws that the shinobi world would consider righteous. But what if she became as delusional as Danzo? What if the world they helped create was as broken as the one that came before? Sakura didn't have answers, and she couldn't afford to linger on her own thoughts. Maybe that was the true consequence of war. You had enemies and people to protect. You didn't have time to think or question. You didn't have time to consider the world this war would create. If you hesitated, you died, or someone you loved died. Oniki had been through 3 wars now. Wars that had lasted far longer than this skirmish would. Sakura couldn't bring herself to imagine what any of them must have been like. Sent into battle each day, too tired to question, too worried to stop. What would such a life have done to the shinobi that survived it? What were the consequences of those shinobi living to lead the villages they helped protect? Sakura saw the consequences of war now in her teacher, and saw the consequences trickle down to affect her comrades. Sakura knew she did not feel the shift of war as they did, and now she knew for certain that she hoped she never would. The shift didn't create soldiers, it created monsters. It created people incapable of seeing a life beyond violence. It created people who thrived on violence. It created men like Danzo. It had to stop here. All of this had to stop here. Oniki had been right, but Sakura didn't even think he knew how right he had been. It wasn't just about stopping the shinobi countries from spatting with each other. It was about creating a future where men like Danzo weren't needed anymore. It was about creating a world where war wasn't an option. And Sakura couldn't help but wonder what consequences that would bring. There were 14 of them in total. 4 teams of 3 with Kakashi at the head, plus Shikamaru. They naturally fell into a rhythm with their teams, which only made sense. Sakura knew Gaara and Sai's fighting styles now, and they had subconsciously tailored themselves to work around each other. She knew how Naruto worked better than most, but not as well as she'd used to. She saw now that Naruto wasn't just surging ahead due to the enthusiasm for battle, but to direct the heat off of Shikamaru and Ino, who worked better from the sidelines. Naruto and Shuji danced around each other in a manner that spoke to months of working as a team, and neither one of them was very far from their other teammates. Shikamaru and Ino immobilized with a combination of shadows and well-timed poisons, then Naruto and Shuji finished the enemy off. Sakura knew fully well how well-known the Ino Shikacho families were for teamwork, but Naruto had somehow fit himself right in. Maybe in the future, Uza would join the infamous lineup. Team 8 was even more interesting to watch at work. Whereas Team 10 focused more on taking down single opponents efficiently, 8 sought to debilitate large crowds in quick succession. Hinata was the eyes, directing her 2 teammates to pockets of enemy shinobi, and Kiba and Shino would fly forward like arrows. The infamous, fang over fang, technique would barrel through the crowd, and whomever wasn't knocked out by the sheer force of the blow was immediately swarmed by Shino's Kikaichu and disabled. Hinata largely stayed out of combat, but this appeared to be intentional. Whenever either Kiba or Shino were injured, they returned to Hinata's side, where she would await with healing ointments and the protection of the fierce gentle fist. She would make a fine medic nin if her father allowed it, Sakura realized, and even amidst battle Sakura couldn't help but quickly chuckle over the thought of the timid girl apprenticing under Tsunade. Maybe, if they'd survive this, she'd slip Hinata the suggestion. Team Guy were perhaps the heaviest hitting team of them all. Neji had none of the timidness of his cousin and went for enemy shinobi with a gusto that had to have been cultivated by a couple years under Guy's enthusiasm. If anything, Neji and Lee seemed to be in a race to see who could take down the most opponents on their way to Danzo, and if there was an enemy they happened to miss, they were quickly dispatched by Tenten, who as always hit with terrifying accuracy. And then there was Kakashi himself, headband pulled up to reveal his single Sharingan, who matched his opponent's move for move until he could learn their openings and move in for a decisive strike. The 14 of them bulldozed through the battlefield in search of Danzo, and even though there seemed to be a disadvantage of numbers against them, they refused to allow themselves to be stopped. Everyone seemed to have a bit at stake. Everyone knew what letting Danzo escape might cost. Grass and River had seemingly brought their entire shinobi force to the battle, and Suna had certainly brought a majority. That, coupled with a good portion of Konoha's own forces turning against her, meant that they were quite vastly outnumbered. Taki and Aim had each only brought 1 genin team to participate in the exams, which meant the majority of the defending force consisted of IWA and loyal Konoha shinobi, as well as a few teams from Plains. If Danzo had succeeded in crippling the cage, he very likely would have succeeded, but the instant the cage joined into the fray, the battle changed. Sakura had never seen Oniki really fight before. He'd demonstrated earth techniques, sure, and she'd sparred against him that one day for Sai's freedom, but watching him now only showed her how much her sensei had held back. Most terrifying to see was Oniki's famed dust release. Though the technique took time to prepare, the instant Oniki unleashed it, anyone within the jutsu's range disintegrated into dust within seconds. The man used it sparingly, but even just seeing it for the first time was enough to remind Sakura that the old man was Tsuchikage for a reason, even at his age. And Tsunade, if ever there was a woman deserving of the title of the world's strongest kunoichi, well, Sakura might have always put her forth as a candidate. But seeing her in action just solidified the belief. She'd see the woman take weapon strikes and jutsu blows that would have killed any other shinobi, but Tsunade would shrug them off and just keep going. Sakura wondered, in another life, what sort of shinobi she would have become if she'd apprenticed under Tsunade somehow, if Tsunade would have accepted her, wanted her. Would she have been side by side with Naruto instead, killing with monstrous strength and healing her own wounds without a second thought? But Tsunade wasn't the only female powerhouse on the field. Perhaps the most interesting fighter was Konan, who could somehow summon thousands of paper seals, paper shuriken, paper birds that could fly at her foes. Even her own clones were made of paper, and no enemy seemed to be able to land a single hit without realizing they'd been fighting paper birds the entire time. If Tsunade was a bull on the battlefield, Konan was a shrike, expertly moving her enemies about until she could impale them on a flurry of shuriken. At one point, Konan even used her paper to form massive wings that lifted her into the air, and Sakura realized then why Konan was the angel of Omegacore. The cage proved an adequate distraction for the 14, as the enemy cage were drawn towards the heavier fighters in order to protect their own. But Danzo was notably absent on this battlefield, and after scouring the village boundaries, it was clear that Danzo had retreated somewhere to regroup, or perhaps to avoid the dangers of battle. Even Sai noted that some of the more prominent members of Root were missing, no doubt providing protection for their leader. It didn't take long to deduce where Danzo would have gone. Root had a base, Sai and Kakashi both knew of it, located deep underground beneath the cage monument. It was expansive, of course. There were hundreds of rooms and tunnels, some of which housed the Root agents, some of which served as training facilities, and others as simple storage areas for knowledge, supplies, even prisoners that were deemed too important for the true Konoha prison above. Sai even knew of rooms whose doors were hidden with seals to prevent anyone but the more higher-ranking officers of Root from knowing of them. Normally, Sakura doubted trying to find Danzo in such a base would be possible. However, with two Hyuga at their disposal, it had to be possible. Most barriers weren't capable of blocking the Byakugan completely, and even if Root had developed such a barrier, they would still be able to narrow down where those rooms were and thus narrow down the search. Still, it was going to be like running into the lion's den. Not even Sai could predict how the base would be trapped since his departure, and none of them knew precisely how many Root agents would be waiting for them inside. They couldn't afford to pull more shinobi from the outside battle either, not when they were so outnumbered. It was possible that none of them would leave the base alive. As they reached the entrance to the tunnels, it was only natural that they hesitated to enter. Danzo's Sharingan had immobilized several cage, and that was on his own. Now Danzo had potentially dozens of Root shinobi at his disposal, and they'd be entering somewhere that he'd had weeks to prepare a defense for since Sai's leaving. If anyone has any doubts, now is the time to return to defending the village. Kakashi told them. You come in here with us, assume you won't be coming out again. Sakura felt her heart sink downward as Kakashi voiced her fears aloud. Maybe she shouldn't have been afraid. She had her friends with her, 12 other capable shinobi who were at this point far above Genin rank. She'd faced down Akatsuki before, faced down the demons of Taki, challenged a cage and then trained under him. How much more prepared for this sort of mission could she possibly be? Still, Sakura reached up to put a hand on her amulet, looking for something to ground her as she prepared to face the challenge ahead. She felt Gaara reach out to take her other hand in his own, and even Sai deigned to put a hand on her shoulder. It's what most of us have been working for, Shikamaru commented. Seems kind of silly to back down now. Speak for yourself, we only just got dragged into this mess. Tenten replied. But still, we're not going to abandon you guys. I don't think Lee would forgive us. Of course we cannot give up now. Sakura has worked hard to uncover this enemy, so to give up now would mean all of that work would be for nothing. Everyone else helped too, Sakura pointed out. Shika's right, this is what we've been working for. We're the ones who uncovered all of this, and we're going to be the ones to finish it. Damn right. Naruto agreed. This bastard is gonna get what's coming. There was an underlying growl to Naruto's words, and Sakura could see that the striped marks on the boy's cheeks had darkened and stretched across his skin. Was that the influence of the Kyuubi? She'd seen the effect of Shukaku's aura on Gaara, but with the new seal, Shukaku's chakra was more like a shield around him. The Kyuubi's chakra, it seemed to be integrated into Naruto's very bones, riling up as he did. Sakura couldn't help but wonder if the Kyuubi could see what Naruto did, as Shukaku saw through Gaara's eyes. Did the Kyuubi want Danzo dead as well? Or was he perhaps just driven by a hatred for the village that imprisoned him? Two Jinchuriki, several clan heirs, and several talented shinobi. Maybe it wasn't her ideal situation, but it certainly could have been a lot worse. Even Danzo would have a hard time against this team, all now equally motivated against him. It's decided, then. Kakashi looked back towards them, and Sakura could have sworn she saw pride in her mentor's eyes. Shikamaru, you're a sharp kid. How do you suggest we enter? Gaara in front. Shikamaru said immediately. Naruto, you keep his flank. Gaara's sand will provide automatic defense from any traps we miss, and Naruto heals quickly. Kiba, Sai, and Kakashi behind. Kiba can try to pick out Danzo's scent, Kakashi and Sai have experience with the base so they'll have a better chance of knowing what to expect. Keep the Hyuga in the middle so they can scan the area and relay information quickly. Sakura and Shuji can stay with them for protective support. If we lose the Hyuga, we might potentially lose our chance to quickly find Danzo. Ino, Tenten, and I will follow for back-end support. Shino and Lee in the back. Shino, you'll be responsible for making sure any shinobi we disable won't be able to use jutsu if they wake back up again. Let your Kakaicha have a good, long meal. Lee, you've got the reflexes to survive any potential attacks from the rear, and if we need to call for assistance you're the quickest shinobi here. If things go sour, we'll be counting on you to get back up. It was a solid plan, one Shikamaru had no doubt been coming up with since they realized they'd need to infiltrate the base. The group fell in line to fill their stated positions, and they allowed themselves only a moment to take a breath and prepare themselves. Sakura saw Gaara's body flare up with Shukaku's power, and even the earth beneath his feet began to crackle and swirl around him. All right. We focus on finding and subduing Danzo. Anything else we find down there, we leave alone. Remember that Sai used to be a root agent. The shinobi here are misguided. They are our enemies, but they are also our fellow Konoha citizens. Whomever we can leave alive, try to. But prioritize your own life above theirs. We need every man we can get to fight Danzo. We can't afford to lose anyone on the way in. Weapons were drawn, dojutsu activated, and Sakura made sure her rock gauntlets were still solid. There were no further speeches or rousing battle cries. With a signal from Kakashi, Naruto kicked down the door to the base with Kyuubi enhanced strength and they began to move inside. It was not a rush, they could not afford it to be. Every time they came across a new hallway or junction, the two Hyuga scanned the area for seals or traps or enemies. For the first few minutes, their journey was surprisingly and eerily silent. There were occasional rumbles from the battle above and rubble gently fell onto their heads and to the ground below. The tunnels were dark, and would have been pitch black if not for the flickering lights that had been rigged to the ceiling. Every flicker seemed to cast a shadow that could easily have been mistaken for an enemy, and more than once Sakura saw Gaara's sand flare up in preliminary defense. Still, for the first stretch of the base, there was nothing. Barrier shielded room ahead. Byakugan has difficulty perceiving past it. Sakura heard Niji whisper. There's at least a dozen figures inside, but it's hard to make out exactly whom. Hinata added. They're in some sort of defensive formation, but I can't see anything more than that. Expecting us. Shikamaru concluded. The door is probably trapped. Can you make out anything about the room's layout? There's the door with the barrier seal, and there's also 3 further exits from the room. I doubt we'll be able to see further until we're inside. What if it's a diversion? Sai asked. Danzo could be making it seem as though he's behind an army while he slips away elsewhere. Or he could be expecting us to think that and waste our time looking elsewhere. Sakura countered. And perhaps knowing we'd think of that, he might be trying to split us up. I don't see anywhere else nearby that's occupied. Niji admitted. If he is elsewhere, it's nowhere close. Considering how large the base is, we could waste a lot of time leaving to search elsewhere. We can't split up. Right now our best option is to investigate. Shikamaru decided. Gaara, do you think your sand can fend off any traps if we bust down the door? Does a camel shit in the desert? Gaara's voice deepened with Shukaku's influence for a moment, and after Shukaku receded, Gaara blushed slightly. I mean. Yes. Right. We'll swarm in behind Gaara and try to disable as many as we can in the initial breakthrough. Sound good? There were no disagreements with Shikamaru's plan, and with that the group prepared themselves. The barrier was held up by several paper seals, all of which Sai was thankfully familiar with. All it took was overlaying the pattern with a different series of seals and they'd be able to break through. It required precise timing and perfect aim, as all the new seals would have to be overlaid at once. Thankfully, Tenten was perfect for the job. Sai quickly sketched the seals to life and Tenten threw them, causing a strange sizzle and a release of chakra that everyone in the party could feel. Before the enemy had time to react, Gaara was slamming his sand into the door with powerful force, enough so that the doors were blown off their hinges and thrust inside. The group threw themselves in afterwards, ready to scrap. Sakura paled when she realized what they had run into. The figures that the Hyuga had seen inside the room were not shinobi at all, but rather training dummies that had been set up in a mock defensive formation. More disturbingly, they were covered with dozens upon dozens of paper seals, all of which were now sizzling ominously. Hug the walls. She heard Kakashi cry out. Rude had expected them to bring Hyuga, she realized. The barrier hadn't been to hide the room, it had been to hide the dummies. Sakura threw herself towards one of the exits, and she saw the rest of her teammates heading towards doors, trying to escape the room before the bombs went off. The last thing she saw after that was Gaara's sand attempt to coalesce around the dummies in the form of a dome. Then, she felt a rush of force as all of the dummies exploded at once. Gaara's sand succeeded in taking the force of the blow, and for a moment Sakura thought they were in the clear. They'd been pushed back slightly, but the group appeared unharmed. Then, she heard cracking. Gaara hadn't protected the ceiling from the blow, instead having directed his effort to keeping the force from their comrades. They were safe, but the force of the bombs had been directed upwards instead. There were several cracks and then a large rumble, and then the ceiling began to tumble down. Sakura felt herself being pulled away from the center and towards the door she'd rushed towards before, and with that darkness overtook her as the room behind her collapsed. The ceiling lights had been disabled by the collapse, so it was Sakura's flashlight flickering to life that allowed her to take stock of the hall around her. She had a few scrapes, but nothing lethal, and it looked like the people around her were carefully stirring to their feet as well. Gaara, Sai, Naruto, and Ino, 4 people out of the 14 had made it into her hallway, and all she could hope was that the others had made it out as well before the collapse. She let Gaara help her to her feet, still a bit shaky from having survived such a deadly trap. Well, you were right. You protected us from the traps. Sai commented dryly. Too bad you didn't protect the roof. Kiss my ass, dust mite. Shukaku spat out. You're alive, aren't you? No arguing, you two. Sakura insisted. We're down to 5 and we don't know what's waiting for us this way. She focused, doing what she should have done earlier instead of relying on the Byakugan, and sent out a pulse of her sensing chakra. Behind them, she picked up on 9 chakra signatures. Her comrades were alive. Sakura let out a sigh of relief. Everyone else made it out before the collapse. And, she sent out another pulse, this one stronger than the last, and though she couldn't help but wince as Gaara and Naruto's signatures flooded her senses, she caught wind of a speck of chakra in the distance ahead of them. There's actual enemies that way, I think. Either that or there's something that's exuding chakra. We still have a mission to complete. Ino concluded with a nervous swallow. Do you think we stand a chance against Danzo with just the 5 of us? Come on, Ino, you're with the future Hokage. Naruto insisted, patting her back in a manner that wasn't exactly the gentlest. Plus, you've got Sakura and Gaara here and they're some of the strongest shinobi I know. Oh, and I guess Sai is here too. Someone needed enough brains here to make up for the ones you're lacking. Okay, we really don't have time for posturing. Sakura insisted, reaching out to gently thwop Naruto and Sai both on the back of their heads. We have unknown enemy numbers ahead, and we know Danzo is capable of using Sharingan to immobilize opponents. We all know how to break out of Izanami now, but that just means he'll be forced to use techniques that we don't know about. Our best option is to try and knock Danzo out with poison so we can remove the Sharingan and bring him in for proper judgment from the Hokage, but I doubt he's going to go that easily. If we have to kill him, we need to be prepared to. Sakura looked to Naruto and Ino. Have either of you two killed on a mission before this? It's happened. Ino answered for them. We won't hesitate, Sakura. You don't have to worry about that. Right. Sakura nodded. Gaara, you should keep in front in case Danzo's left any more nasty surprises. I'll keep using my sensing jutsu to make sure we're not snuck up on. Are we ready to move forward? There was silent agreement, and all they could do from there was move on. Son of a bitch. Shikamaru cursed as he brushed rubble off his jacket. Nearby, he saw the two Hyuga helping each other up, and behind them Chuji was checking the stability of the rubble. I can give it a try, Shikamaru, but I don't think I can break through it without causing more to collapse on top of us. He counted on us coming in with Byakugan. Neji added. The barrier warped our perception of those dummies. We only saw figures that looked like shinobi. That means he planned to separate us, maybe even take one or two of us down in the process. Can you see the others through the rubble? They're alive. 5 to our left, 5 across from us. If we can't go back, our only option is to see if there's an exit down these tunnels. Danzo wouldn't have risked blocking himself in. Any of these tunnels could have collapsed at any point. Shikamaru began to deduce. Right now our mission is to find an exit, and if we run into Danzo on the way, he hesitated. Neji, Hinata, Chuji, and himself, it wasn't exactly a good team for taking on the root commander, even if Neji was considered a Byakugan prodigy. We don't engage. He concluded. Right now we need to either find a way to regroup or find a way out to seek help. We stay as quiet as we can and hope we don't attract any unwanted attention. It was a long shot. Danzo would surely have expected at least a few shinobi to survive the blast. But right now, it was the only shot they had. Kakashi admittedly wasn't very fond of cave-ins. After all, that was how Obito had died. Thankfully, it looked as though none of the genin in his section of the room had gotten injured. Gaara's sand had done a good job of keeping most of the force of the blow away from them. But that was only 4 of the genin accounted for, with no way of determining the state of the other 9. And the rubble behind them was far too thick to dig through to find out. 2 of Guy's students were here, the weapons girl and the Taijutsu clone, Lee. The other 2 were from Kurene's team, the Abarame and the Inyazuka, dog included. Still a somewhat formidable team, but lacking the visual prowess of the Hyuga meant that they'd be moving through the corridors blind. Kakashi had a vague recollection of the layout of the root base, but it had been years since he'd actually set foot in it. We need to find a way out. Kakashi decided. If we find Danzo on the way, we attempt to neutralize him. Shino, was it? Your Kakaicha will probably be our best shot. Sharingan transplants require a large amount of chakra to use, and if he's drained, he can't use them. Kiba, we'll be counting on you and your partner to sniff out potential threats. Maybe even a way out if you can catch scent of outside air. Got it. Kiba replied. Hey, Akamaru doesn't really smell any blood. It probably means the others are alright. Thank goodness. Tenten let out a sigh of relief. If Danzo's willing to bring down the base to stop us, that must mean he plans on escaping out of it, right? He can't be planning on using this again. Most likely. And that just means he either planned on getting us stuck here forever, or he has an escape route somewhere down these halls. Stick together and keep vigilant. Kakashi let himself take point. Right now, his biggest concern was keeping the kids safe. Still, he couldn't help but get a sinking feeling that keeping safe was going to be harder than he'd initially thought. Deep within the caverns of the root base, tremors echoed through the halls and into a darkened room. It only stopped the medic temporarily. Carefully, one by one, the medic removed eyes from Danzo's arm and replaced them with one of the Jared eyeballs at his side. You've used up more than half of your stock, Lord Danzo. The medic told him. I'd suggest you'd be more careful with these ones. You recall that using Izanami renders them useless. Of course I recall it. Danzo snapped. I may not have a choice in the matter. An agent nearby, a scout, stood by the door with a kunai ready. The report had already been made. Sakura Haruno had broken through Izanami and had somehow freed the other cage. Unless the cage were dealt with, the battle might fall out of their favor. Danzo needed a different kind of technique now. If immobilizing them would not work, he would just have to deal with them permanently. The new transplants, coupled with the boost given to him by Hashirama's cells, would give him about 20 minutes of Izanagi. Assuming he could get the drop on the cage, that would be more than enough time to take them out for good. Sir. There's people coming this way. Less than half a dozen. The scout shifted, preparing to defend his leader against the intruders. Outside the door there were 2 more guards at the ready, but that and the medic were all that stood between the attackers and Danzo. Still, less than half a dozen? With Izanagi at his disposal, it would be easy enough. Danzo flexed his arm, feeling the rush of chakra begin to pull into it as the Sharingan eyes awakened. It was time. Check the description for the links to the author.